for being here. Today is Tuesday, March 19th. This is a work session of the Portland City Council. This is a continuation of our council budget work sessions. Today we're going to hear from the City Budget Office, the Office of Management and Finance. We will take a short break. Then we'll hear from the Office of the City Auditor, and then Portland Parks and Recreation. Excuse me. As was the case last time, I will ask each of the bureaus to remain within their time frame. I'd ask that we hold off on questions until the completion of the presentations, and I will ask us to wrap up at the designated time. So first up is the City Budget Office. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, and good morning, Mayor, Council, Madam Auditor, colleagues, and advisors. My name, as you know, is Jessica Kennard. I'm the Interim Budget Director. I'm here with Ryan Kinsella, our Interim Assistant Budget Director, and Shannon Carney, our Lead Performance Management Analyst. I'm going to follow other bureaus' good examples and try to be brief today. So to start us off, we are one of the city's smallest bureaus with a total budget of $2.8 million and 15.5 FTE. As you can see, the vast majority of our expenses go towards personnel costs. A notable portion of our materials and services budget supports maintenance costs of the city's enterprise-wide budget software system. The City Budget Office has one program called Budget and Economics, but we have a few distinct functions within that program, which this chart illustrates. On the left, you can see that we provide administrative management and dedicated independent analytical support to the Portland Utility Board. These activities are supported through interagency resources from the Water Bureau and the Bureau of Environmental Services. On the right, we have our city economist, who provides economic and forecasting functions for the city and for the office. And the majority of our work, you can see here, is in the center, providing citywide performance, budgeting, and analysis. Most of you are familiar with our work this time of year, running the budget process and providing analysis on and reviews of budget requests. However, we provide analysis and support year-round with a variety of tasks, many of which are mandated by city policy. We review and provide analysis on over 800 distinct budget requests throughout the year through the supplemental and annual budget processes. We review and provide analysis on the over 700 council agenda items that council considers every year. We monitor the revenues and expenses of all 28 city bureaus. We provide fiduciary oversight of the general fund and recently the cannabis fund. We manage the city's enterprise-wide budget software system. And we lead citywide performance management initiatives and support bureau performance management efforts. And we also facilitate the convening and reporting of the citywide capital asset management group, among other duties. Demographically, while we have significantly increased the prevalence of women in our staff and in bureau management roles, our staff representation from communities of color have remained close to 25% in recent years. As part of Bureau equity goals in our affirmative action plan, we plan to work with HR to improve outreach and recruitment of candidates from racially diverse communities and to continue to examine and train on bias as part of our recruitment efforts. This slide shows the why and the how of what we do in CBO. CBO Strategic Vision can be seen as three overarching goals that build upon one another, as represented in the blue triangle. The foundation of our work is to ensure city compliance with budget law and to provide adequate fiduciary oversight of the general fund and cannabis fund. This is the role and function of your basic budget office and entails a significant amount of work coordinating and preparing required budget processes and documents. However, as a central independent budget office, we're uniquely positioned to leverage our existing staff and build upon this foundation to provide enhanced public value to city leaders and to the public. CBO seeks to generate this public value by empowering decision makers to maximize the achievement of city goals in the face of constrained resources. Ultimately, our highest goal, which you see at the top of the triangle, through these efforts is to facilitate a well-functioning, equitable, and resilient city. The green boxes that you see around the triangle represent the essential inputs to achieving these goals. These are core components CBO strives to produce through our work. In the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through each of these, but I'm available to answer any questions that you have. I will note that we consider customer service as an incredibly important input to achieving our goals, and our customers include bureaus, city elected officials, and members of the public. In terms of our operational assets, all of this work is accomplished via our staff and our relationships and partnerships throughout the city. We rely heavily on hiring really great employees and on council and bureau support to achieve these goals. one more thing on this. So we've not explicitly called out how an emphasis on racial and disability equity fits into this chart because those values are incorporated throughout. We try to integrate an equity lens into all of our work, and we use specific tools such as the budget equity tool. We ask pointed questions and highlight impacts on equity plans and on historically underserved communities through our analyses, and we distribute the responsibility of implementing our racial equity plan among several staff to integrate the work throughout the Bureau. CBO has 2 budget requests for council consideration, both of which strengthen our green strategic inputs. First is a request to support an increase in budget software and maintenance costs. This request is for $52,000, which, as CBO's an overhead-funded bureau, equates to approximately $24,000 in discretionary resources. When we conducted our RFP to replace our aging budget software, we realized that ongoing software maintenance costs had increased beyond what the prior system required. While the vendor we selected was relatively more affordable than the other options, the cost still exceeds our currently budgeted resources by $52,000. This is an enterprise-wide database that all bureaus use to ensure budget communications consistency, citywide financial resiliency, and compliance with budget law. Most enterprise budget software is generally managed by the Bureau of Technology Services, where these types of costs would be funded via increases to BTS rates and automatically passed along to bureaus. However, for CBO, we must be appropriated additional resources. CBO has to pay this cost. The question is merely how. As we have already absorbed a 1% reduction via reduction to materials and services, absorbing this cost would require cutting staff. CBO is currently investigating other funding options if discretionary resources aren't available. Let's see here. Our second request is for $150,000 in ongoing resources to support the annual collection of citywide quantitative and qualitative data on resident perspectives, priorities, and needs. This equates to a discretionary ask of approximately $70,000. This year, CBO received one-time resources totaling $60,000 for the piloting of the survey. After conducting significant stakeholder engagement with city bureaus, we completed a competitive RFP and selected the vendor, and results will be available within coming months. During our pilot year, CBO invested a lot of time identifying what information bureaus really need and how they would use it. We have learned that some of the most needed and valuable information is data on how the city is meeting the needs of distinct geographical and demographic communities. There are survey methods that can be employed to provide this level of data, but they frequently require more funding. CBO has decided to absorb the additional cost this year to improve our ability to provide this data through our pilot process. This proposal then seeks to enhance the data by also adding a qualitative collection method to empower the city to dive more deeply into specific issue areas and collect information that's harder to capture using quantitative methods. These 2 components, the qualitative and the quantitative, will combine to provide a powerful tool for bureaus in the city in deciding how we prioritize our limited resources and organize our operations to better meet service level goals. CBO has worked closely with partner bureaus on this pilot and on this proposal. CBO tracks a number of performance measures to indicate progress towards achieving our strategic goals. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to walk through each of these, although again, I'm happy to answer questions. One clarification point is that your handout has a typo. The first performance measure actually held steady at 45% in fiscal 17-18, and your handout states that it dropped. I do want to highlight that a number of these performance measures actually reflect the performance of other bureaus' activities, which means that we hold ourselves accountable to what other bureaus and the city as a whole is accomplishing. This is because we want to measure our bureau's success by the city's ability to become more effective and fiscally resilient in alignment with that top part of our strategic triangle. This has been an eventful year for the City Budget Office, and I'm incredibly proud of our accomplishments. We have successfully deployed 2 major citywide change initiatives and a new pilot project. We went live with our new budget system on time last December and received commendations on our project management and implementation from the city's Technology Oversight Committee, as well as from implementation partners. Our staff have dedicated enormous time and effort to this project, contributing thousands of combined hours to build, deploy, learn, troubleshoot, and train others on the system. I want to especially recognize the work of our phenomenal analyst turned project manager, Jessica Eden, who has been a one-woman powerhouse in structuring and managing all project needs. Staff have also dedicated significant time and effort to building and deploying requested changes and improvements to the budget process. These include major shifts in the way the entire city views and connects with both the base budget and changes to the budget, which you all are aware of. And of course, we're piloting our new annual survey, which I just discussed. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have maintained high-quality core service levels and implemented these major projects, all while undergoing significant changes in leadership and staffing. Our long-term director departed for another opportunity last June, as you know, and in less than 1 year, our office experienced a 35% turnover rate. We would not have accomplished these feats without the amazing dedication and hard work of every single member of our team. We also borrowed heavily on the hard work and the patience of our Bureau financial contacts and leaders, and on the advice and trust of council. I want to thank bureaus and council for your partnership through this year, and I want to publicly acknowledge and thank my staff, which are some of the most brilliant, thoughtful, and committed people I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Looking forward, we will continue to need to dedicate significant staff resources towards the two aforementioned change efforts. While our staffing levels have stabilized, we have 6 people currently operating in temporary roles, and we will work in ensuing months on creating additional stability through permanent appointments. On the horizon are challenges presented by personnel cost uncertainty, as CBO, like other bureaus, must figure out how to manage potential increased personnel costs and merit increases with changes in our class and comp structure. With that, I'm available to answer questions.
Very good. Dr. Smith, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, maybe. You. Good morning. Nothing right just this moment.
Very good. Okay. Questions?
After you, Frida.
As always, I have a couple of questions. On the maintenance system that you're requesting the increase on, what type of services will they be providing? I've helped implement a couple of company-wide systems, so I'm curious on what they're going to be providing.
Yeah, so it's primarily the system that we use to collect all of the budget information across the city, but it also has a performance module, so we're collecting performance data so that we can report. It is the fundamental system that allows us to produce the adopted budget book, and it is also facilitating the program look for each bureau, which is a significant change this budget process. So, and program by program, it's allowing us to provide qualitative narrative information as well as performance information and financial information.
No, I was asking what you're want a maintenance contract. What kind of services is the company going to provide you in a way of maintenance?
Yeah.
Impressive.
Okay, so that's a great question. Our new budget software system is a cloud-hosted system, so the service level agreement is significantly more expensive than our previous system, which was on-premise. That's the
bulk of the cost is going in the cloud?
That is the bulk of the cost. Yeah, so we have additional costs on an ongoing basis. They were $63,000 per year. They're now $112,000, which is significant. We replaced our previous system back in 2003. The service level agreement in 2003 is a different rate than it would be in 2018-19. And we also have a much more robust reporting platform that goes along with the current budget system.
But are they also providing additional training or troubleshooting or anything like that with the service agreement?
Yeah, absolutely. So our vendor, their Sherpa, any of the problems with the budget system, currently our process is that, finance staff throughout the city can contact their analyst. If they cannot troubleshoot that problem, it comes to me, the functional administrator, and then they are responsible to handle everything else in a 4-hour agreement if it's a tier 1, an 8-hour turnaround if it's a tier 2, and then within the week if it's a tier 3.
Okay. Next question is, East Portland Action Plan Civic Engagement has requested many times to include interpretation, accommodations in the overhead funding, which it appears was not a good way to go. They are interested in making it a line item budget. Of all the information I've read so far, there's only one bureau who could identify how much they were spending on those items. And I know that a budget software is similar to accounting. It's line items. Is it feasible to add a line item to every bureau's budget so they can identify and know what they're spending?
So that would actually, I think, be more of an accounting issue. We'd have to set up a separate sort of accounting line item to track that, but we can have that conversation with the accounting division and see
Okay.
if that seems like a feasible option.
It's very encouraged that way. They know what they're spending in spring bump. If they don't spend it all, they can roll it into something else, you know, that type of thing. One more question on your survey. Since you've taken responsibility for the community survey now, how are you reaching out to our communities of color and English as their second language, et cetera?
Yeah, I can take that question. I'm Shannon Carney, a performance management analyst with CBO. So we have a very robust community engagement strategy with our survey this year, and we're excited about it. We're actually taking a different approach than what's been done previously, which was a mail survey, via postal mail. And we're going to be doing basically a combination of an online platform where it's opt-in, and so anyone can take the survey, and pairing that with canvassers that are actually going to go out into specific neighborhoods. So the canvassers are our main strategy for ensuring that our sample is demographically balanced, that basically reflects the city, and that we're ensuring a robust sample size of specific community groups.
Okay, in your canvassers, will they be speaking the language of our minority groups? And also in the online survey, will it be available in multiple languages?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that. So yes, we are. So we're finalizing our plan with specific languages. Currently, our plan is to do 4 languages, so translated into 4 languages. And honestly, our primary constraint with that is budget. We've put additional funds from our own bureau into the survey to be able to do that translation. In terms of languages spoken, yes, the canvassers are going to be the plan is to have youth from community colleges and local colleges, and work with those youth to make sure that we have multiple languages covered.
If you're doing summer surveys, your high schools, I know at our high school, we've been teaching interpretation, how to be an interpreter. You may want to use some of our high schools. We have some students who are extremely adept in both their home language as well as English, and it might work well for you because you'll get them much closer to their location and within their community.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah. And, we appreciate all the feedback. It's been a real learning experience for CBO. And, one other great thing about this particular project is the partnership that we had with Civic Life in particular. And they've been able to basically show us how to engage through the vast number of advisory bodies. And we're going to be using that as our testing platform for the survey.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Frida. You asked a lot of my questions, so I am greatly appreciative. I want to follow up on the EPAP question. I thought a couple of years ago the city had made a policy that they would just incorporate as part of the administrative costs, interpreting and other supports to ensure that we were engaging communities, a broad segment of the community. Is that not the rule, or was that just because of who was in charge at the time?
So I would have to go back and look to see what types of rules were made around that. I know that in our recommendations, CBO has frequently recommended when there's been requests for additional resources that haven't been funded for translation or interpretation services, we have consistently requested that the bureaus prioritize those funds in their base budget. And if that means they need to provide less service, then that's the trade-off, but that we shouldn't be making the trade-off about accessibility.
Right.
The city budget office in our budget is actually reprioritizing $10,000 towards additional translation outreach services to try to make sure that our materials are more accessible.
Thank you very much. The survey, you're replacing the old community survey that was done in your office, is that correct?
That's correct. It was done it was originally completed by the auditor's office for a
Yes.
number of years. It was cut from the auditor's budget a couple of years ago and then added into CBO's budget on a one-time basis.
And is this a broad survey that talks about people's perception of the city of Portland? Is it safe? Is it nice? Do you have trees? That kind of stuff, right?
Yes. So it's a resident survey of community perception of city services. We're also asking a few questions this year about priorities. So, what are residents' hopes? What are their what do they see as Portland's biggest challenge? So we spent a lot of time, looking at the old survey and thinking about what was actually useful from that survey, what were bureaus using for their own performance management, and what was council looking at in terms of thinking bigger picture and setting goals. And so that's why we took so much time, meeting with every single bureau, meeting with you all and your staff to talk about what would you like to see there. So it's we're thrilled to sort of put this all together and get it out in the field in the next few months. It's going to be 20 to 40 questions, so I think that covers a pretty good range. But it'll be great to review the results and think about it again next year. So.
I look forward to that. And I just want to say, Jessica, your team is pretty awesome. And I am very grateful for the work that you did. And I'm not just saying that to butter them up because they said 0 to all my budget requests. But I just greatly appreciate the professionalism and just how open you guys are and how detailed your analysis is. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
So Frida and Commissioner Hardesty covered almost all of my questions, but since the issue of accommodations came up, I just want to put out there that since I've arrived, this is my 3rd budget season, I have been requesting committed central funds for accommodations. I think it's highly problematic that we leave accommodations up to individual bureaus, which results in really inconsistent service to community members who need them. It's confusing for people to know where to go, how to ask, what they may be entitled to, and I see it as a real barrier to participation for people with disabilities and people that need language supports. Are you done crafting the questions for the survey?
There is still, we are getting closer to final, but we're going to be sending around the final draft for basically like one last review.
Oh, great, because I remember talking about it months ago, and I'm glad to hear that you've been engaging with civic life, but I may have a couple more suggestions. And I am curious about how effective you think this tool is in influencing or driving our policy making, because it's all well and good to ask the community how they feel about us or what they want, but if we're asking them year after year and we're not delivering, I don't see it as a worthwhile endeavor.
I completely agree. I think it's something where it's really only going to be useful if bureaus and council actually engage and think about how to use the information. And truly, a citywide survey is a critical piece of information across, almost all of our services. There's things that we can't know about what the public thinks unless we ask them, and it's we're investing a lot into, maintaining our assets, into improving our public safety, all these different major priorities. And I think it's critical that we get that information. I'll just call out that in our decision package proposal for the ongoing survey, we actually proposed to do the quantitative method. So this similar type of survey to what we're doing this year, just every other year. And then in the off years, we'd be doing a more qualitative community listening sessions, focus groups, something that's still scientifically valid, but trying to do more of a deep dive into our particular priority areas and sort of investigating things that might come up in that larger quantitative survey.
And do you bring that back as a report, the results as a report to council?
Yes,
And
yes.
will you create a list of suggested policy changes or initiatives generated by the survey?
Yeah, so we will be bringing back a report. We're anticipating that the report will be complete by the end of the fiscal year. So we'll be back, talking about that, probably June, July. In terms of next steps after that, we're going to keep it more focused on, areas to investigate, and also an accountability framework for how to use that data. So that could mean main areas, of potential policy changes. But I think that would be more of an ongoing conversation as we, start to use the information both to set priorities for the out years and for bureaus to use the information to improve their programs and services.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Great. We have time for one more question, then we're going to move on. Yep,
Just a quick
sure.
question. I may have missed it. What's your goal for the number of households you want to reach? And my second part is, when you finish the report, I think all of us would love to have one as well.
Great, fantastic. So our goal is actually much, much bigger than with a more typical phone or mail survey. So we're hoping to reach around about 6,000, and that's with the online opt-in platform. So we're able to reach more. We're going to be, reaching out through our channels and really promoting the availability of providing feedback to the city.
Right, Dr. Smith.
Just a quick comment. So our office had made recommendations to Jessica and her team, just in terms of thinking about the historical components around surveys and what that looks like for communities of color. And so they're aware of that as they're thinking about how this rolls out. And then also, as we're talking about wanting reporting and sort of understanding results, thinking about what that means for the community and making sure that they also have clear communication about what is coming of the survey and how that then links to some recommendations for change. So just wanted to call that piece out. Thanks.
And quickly, I wanted to thank Dr. Smith and her team for her comments. And actually, we took them into account and we already forwarded them to the vendor. So they're going to be working with us on your suggestions.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Next up is the Office of Management and Finance. Mr. Reinhardt.
I feel like Carmen and I look more and more alike the longer we're in this building.
Good morning, Mayor,
Good morning.
City Council, Community Budget Advisors, Madam Auditor, colleagues. My name is Tom Reinhardt. I am proud to be the city's Chief Administrative Officer and excited to be here with my team representing the over 700 dedicated people in the Office of Management and Finance, some of whom are behind us here, giving us more confidence for our presentation. One of the advantages of attending all of these sessions with you is that I know you want more time for questions and answers. To that end, we will be presenting as a team for approximately 20 minutes and have around 40 minutes for questions. We are already on slide 3, so I better get moving here.
Wow.
What am I doing wrong here, Ryan?
You have to point it
Okay. I'm losing time. That's who we
Yeah, you
are.
blew your time.
Tom, you should yield to the Office of Technology Services.
Not yielding yet, not giving up. What do we do in the Office of Management and Finance? We are the internal service provider of multi-bureau projects and convener of leaders across the organization on enterprise issues. We hope this slide is helpful in explaining the multifaceted work we do. Our base budget priorities, shown here on slide 4, are centered on 3 strategic components of the 2018 to 2020 strategic plan. All of our priorities are embedded in these components. One way to capture the intent of all 3 of these interwoven themes is simply modernize and lead. We say modernize and lead often during our week. I believe you will recognize this framework as our leaders summarize our budget priorities for you today. The leaders sitting with me here at this table and the employees they represent deserve recognition for their many accomplishments over the past year. Just a few highlights for you today. Human Resources has led a transformation in recruitment of new employees that's producing measurable results in the reduction of timelines for hires. Technology Services, several breakthroughs on long-standing challenges, online permitting, and refreshing our website are 2 of them. Revenue and Financial Services, a reorganization within procurement to improve construction services, as well as a solid foundation for replacing our enterprise tax collection system. Finally, asset and project management. We've done a reorganization to provide a data-driven, prevention-focused approach for fleet and facilities. Thank you to the leaders sitting with me and the many people that have been working hard on this. I also want to commend the team for finding personnel cost savings that met the 1% reduction target while continuing to provide our core services. Finally, I believe no organization will fully realize its potential without a focused approach to equity and diversity. It is both a moral and business imperative, and I believe a key factor in our long-term success, particularly to become a 21st century organization. 33% of all OMF employees identify as people of color, and recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce is now a component in our leadership team's annual evaluations. Contracts awarded to disadvantaged, minority, women, and emerging small business prime contractors and subcontractors rose 5% over last year to over 16% and over 50% respectively. We remain committed to continuous improvement in this area. Our Treasury Division keeps city services accessible for all people by requiring bureaus accept cash in addition to electronic options. Technology Services, City Fleet, and our Facilities Division are each developing or have already apprenticeship or internship programs to increase workforce diversity focused on historically underrepresented and underserved communities. Citywide, the diversity of our entire applicant pool for new hires and our hires have increased by 5% since fiscal year 16-17. We are proud of these efforts, but know more work needs to be done. On slide 5, now on the screen and hopefully in front of you, I want to talk briefly about budget considerations. It is critical for you to understand the challenge we face keeping up with the rapid growth in service demand. The Office of Management and Finance exists to serve all city bureaus as well as your offices. We are, in fact, a part of everyone's core budget. Over the past 3 weeks, I sat right over there in one of those 2 chairs and heard multiple bureaus describe plans to expand services. I wanted you to see this slide because as you balance the many competing priorities as citywide elected officials, it is important to understand the 10-year trend. Simply put, we are not keeping pace with the increase in our general fund supported services, particularly human resources, procurement, and our project management capacity. Our top budget priorities. First, as I recommended to you all in our opening budget session, as a city, we should collect every dollar owed by and for taxpayers for public services, both within our bureaus and within our enterprise collection tools. Second, the city of Portland is steadily growing into a large, more diverse city. We should have modern tools like a 311 program integrated into a new, high-functioning, resident-focused website for all Portlanders to easily access services and hold us accountable for results. Third, we have made progress over the last several years to become a much better steward of our community's assets, thanks to council, the infrastructure bureaus, our team, and many others, and their dedicated efforts to this. We need to continue to allocate resources now to save money later. Now, Deputy Chief Administrative Officer Carmen Merlot will summarize the first section of our budget, CAO's Office and Asset Management.
Thank you, Tom. Mayor, Commissioners, Community Budget Advisors, I'm Carmen Merlot, the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer. As you saw from an earlier slide, OMF provides a wealth of services that support our mission-driven bureaus. Among them, the Homelessness and Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program has seen enormous growth in the last 2 years. Because of your leadership, we've added 2 Clean Start trucks that provide a homeless to work program. We now have 7-day-a-week coverage, and we're able to respond to reports within 12 hours. Moreover, our demonstrated success has allowed us to enter into an IGA with ODOT to clean up sites along I-405, I-205, I-26, and very shortly I-84 and I-5. In April of last year, the CAO dissolved the bureau formerly known as the Bureau of Internal Business Services to create a new division of asset management. The division, which includes both fleet and facility services, is intended to place more focus on asset management. You've heard from other bureaus the challenges of deferred maintenance and competition for limited resources, and OMF is no different. We've completed a draft strategic asset management plan that will make our asset decisions less reactive, more efficient, and increasingly focused on innovation and strategic opportunities that extend the life of assets and maximize the return on city investments. Tom talked earlier about our ability to keep up with a growing and diverse city. That also includes a growing and diverse city workforce. One persistent challenge we have is managing citywide space needs. Many of our bureaus are bursting at the seams in their current facilities. Several bureaus are not co-located, and several others continue to expand into leased spaces. I'm pleased to let you know that OMF will be leading a citywide space planning study to learn what bureaus' short and long-term needs are, identify opportunities to establish an East Side presence, determine which bureau adjacencies make sense, and prioritize those bureaus and functions that should be in the downtown core and which can transition to an alternate location. We expect to identify a consultant later this year and come back to you with more information within 12 to 18 months. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about Facility Services' new approach to managing the reconstructed Portland building and interest in transitioning towards this new model for other OMF-owned and operated facilities. Previously, bureaus owned their own technology, appliances, and furniture. This inherently created bureau inequities and limited opportunities to take advantage of economies of scale and other operational efficiencies. Starting with the Portland building, OMF will take an integrated approach to managing these programs and have submitted several decision packages in support of this effort, including positions to help operate citywide technology, as well as provide life cycle replacement costs for IT, furniture, and appliances. Many of these packages were not recommended by CBO, and I look forward to discussing these with you in more detail. For now, I want to turn it over to our Chief Human Resources Officer, Cyrilda Summers-McGee.
Thank you, Carmen. Commissioners, Mayor, and Community Budget Advisors, thank you so much for spending your time with us here today to talk about the work we do and the work we're going to do in the future. I'm going to start my presentation off by just basically giving an overview of the work that BRHR does. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So BHR is comprised of four primary areas. One is employee and labor relations. So employee relations provides the people supports throughout the city, and labor relations provides union support and contract interpretations. We also have total rewards, which is benefits, so all the benefits that employees receive throughout the city of Portland, as well as classification and compensation, so how people get paid and how their positions are classified throughout the strata of the city of Portland. And then we have workforce recruitment and training. So recruitment and training, pretty self-explanatory. The 2018 year in BHR was incredibly busy. I'm going to highlight some of the things that we have changed because it directly impacts the future of the Bureau of Human Resources. In 2018, we centralized orientation, establishing a consistent message about who we are as a city, what we do as a city, and why we do what we do as a city. And the reviews have been fantastic. We had a huge launch, and now we do it every month. We also reimagined recruitment, as Tom highlighted. We originally, when I first got here, it was shared with me that recruitment took too long. It was the #1 complaint that I received the day I walked into the city of Portland. It was taking, on average, around 200 days from the time a position was posted to the time a person started at the city of Portland, which is unheard of in many organizations. And now we are averaging 82 days from the time a position is posted to the time a person is hired at the city of Portland. We also launched a new executive recruitment approach at the city of Portland to fill the bureau director vacancies that we had. In that approach, it started out rocky. I'm a person who's about tell the truth, shame the devil. It started rocky, and then it got better. And now I have to say that we're incredibly proud of the new executive recruitment program, and the people who have been hired as a result of the program are also singing the program's praises, as well as the commissioners who directly interface with the program. In addition, we launched and implemented new systems. We have a new learning management system for the e-learning program that is now more intuitive and easy to use. We launched a new performance management system that we're now piloting with 319 employees currently, and we hope to be able to roll it out citywide and have ironed out all of its bugs and kinks. And then we also launched the BHR's dashboard so that we actually can understand and see in real time what our demographics are in our workforce, what the makeup is, what our recruitment time to fills look like, who's in the applicant process to begin with, and then who do we ultimately select. And I believe that it is a brand new and very transparent approach to recruitment that we've employed throughout the city. And we've also launched a variety of new business initiatives, from our new FMLA pilot program with BOEC and PBOT to our new occupational health nurse who is providing services and wraparound services to many of our employees who need the greatest number of resources from a health standpoint. We now have nutritionists, and we can triage those folks to help them get better and improve in their health and well-being in a different way. And then our customer service approach has transitioned tremendously from recruitment to class comp and the human resources information structure. I give you those highlights because in 2019 and 2020, my objective is to continue to maintain our programs, our processes and efficiencies, and our new customer service approach. We built it, now we need to sustain it. We also provided 3 equity initiatives as decision packages. One was the ADA Title I Program and Accommodations Fund. Right now at the City of Portland, much like Commissioner Udaley was highlighting, that the public, how the public interfaces with accommodations, our workforce also interfaces with our accommodation approach very similarly. We made a pitch by way of our decision package to centralize funds so that employees don't have to go to managers and supervisors and have oftentimes very uncomfortable conversations about the kind of accommodation that they need based on whatever kind of physical challenges that they're up against. We believe that that should come to BHR. We also believe that the casual and temporary hiring process is not as equitable as it should be at the City of Portland. And our temporary and casual opportunities need to be posted on the NeoGov system, just like every other hiring opportunity is posted on our NeoGov system. And those are just a couple of the decision packages that we put forward. Moving forward in 2019, 2020, BHR is focused on culture. We are focusing on culture and thinking about how all of the policies that we create, all the advice and coaching that we provide, how does it impact the culture of the City of Portland, and how does the workforce interface with that culture? How do they feel when it comes to the policies and the practices that we employ and we deploy upon them? Do they feel safe? Do they feel like they all have an equal opportunity to be provided services? And it's starting with BHR, but we interface with every bureau and every division citywide. So it begins with us. Human resources is the culture creation engine of every ecosystem, and that is why it's the focus of BHR in 2019, 2020. That concludes my presentation, and I'm now going to transition it over to the Chief Financial Officer. Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, Community Budget Advisors, and other interested parties. I'm Jennifer Cooperman, Chief Financial Officer and Director of the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services. The BRFSS mission is to be the trusted manager of the city's finances, advancing sustainable, long-term financial health. Our values are integrity, leadership, equity, collaboration, and transparency. Our programmatic goals ensure the collection of over $400 million annually in general fund revenues, the safety and liquidity of the city's cash assets, timely issuance of the city's audited financial statements, financial policies that address good governance, internal controls, and best practices, city compliance with IRS, SEC, FEMA, and other federal and grantor requirements, cost-effective financing of the city's capital improvements and infrastructure. City properties are insured, workers' compensation claims are administered timely, and employees are advised regarding safety and loss prevention, and that bureaus can efficiently acquire the goods and services needed to support city business. I'm proud to say that the BRFS team has the financial acumen, industry knowledge, and depth of government experience to deliver on these citywide goals. And I'll take a moment to note, we understand for some prior work sessions that you're interested in discussing social equity in contracting citywide. Chief Administrative Officer Tom Reinhardt, Chief Procurement Officer Lester Spittler, and I are prepared to facilitate a work session on this specific topic. Next slide. BRFS's top budget priority is to invest in a new integrated tax system to replace legacy software that is approaching end of life and will soon be unsupported. A new tax platform will preserve the city's ability to collect $400 million annually for the general fund, and through seamless integration with federal tax information is expected to increase our tax collections. Revenue collection is a core mission-critical city service, and procurement of an ITS platform is the city's most immediate financial need. Our second priority is to permanently fund revenue collection staff who have been funded serially one time. We require this staff to maintain current collection levels and believe these staff will continue to more than pay for themselves. Our final priority is to procure a cyber insurance policy that will transfer the costs over a negotiated deductible from malware, ransomware, and phishing incidents to an insurance company, thereby reducing the city's risk profile. Each of BRFS's budget priorities are intended to improve the city's long-term financial sustainability. And now I'll hand it over to the city's Chief Technology Officer.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, Mayor, City Council, Community Budget Advisors. I'm Jeff Baer, the Director of the Bureau of Technology Services. As you've heard, BTS is a complex organization with numerous business lines, including our public safety, technology support, our cybersecurity, customer relations, network engineering, telecommunications, printing, distribution, server management, and desktop support. The majority of our time is spent running and maintaining our mission-critical technology applications, such as our telephones, our computers, our networks, our SAP environment, video, and our first responder 800 megahertz radio system, just to name a few. You'll see on slide 14 budget requests that have a significant technology component associated with them, and we plan to review these with our internal Bureau Customer Stakeholders Group. Actually, it's happening tomorrow morning. We review new service offerings like these with our Bureau customers to help prioritize and determine the level of support for these new services and address any concerns that they may have related to cost impacts to their providing these new enterprise services. On slide 15, as leaders in deploying large-scale enterprise solutions, I wanted to call out these initiatives that the Technology Executive Steering Committee, which is chaired by our Chief Administrative Officer, approved as our 2019 technology priorities. And you'll see on here some familiar items, POPs, the Portland Online Permitting System. We launched the electronic plans earlier this year. We've also put out the Development Hub, or Dev Hub as it's known, and work continues on deploying the remaining work streams. The Portland Online website refresh is really designed to take a whole new look to our city's website and really designed to be a community-focused services directory that will allow everyone with all abilities to easily engage and find city services. The beta site was successfully launched and work continues on developing online content. The Portland Building Technology and the Move Back is coming soon. We've got the initial design of the technology systems has already begun, and we expect to begin installing this summer. The fiber broadband strategy and expansion. This is strictly focused on the city's ERNI and INET systems. And we've been hosting a number of different external stakeholders meetings with our external partners over the past several months, and we'll be coming back to council with some options to further build out this fiber network. And I want to be clear that this work we are doing on this particular project isn't related to 5G or any kind of a residential high-speed broadband service. It's simply focused on public sector customers like Multnomah County, Multnomah Educational Service District, Portland Public Schools, City of Gresham, and others, just to name a few. These key initiatives align with adopting 21st century business solutions, leading citywide initiatives, and though I've only focused on the larger projects, we have a long list of other projects that we are also working on. With that, I'm going to turn it back to our Chief Administrative Officer, Tom Reinhardt.
Council, Community Budget Advisors, we trust that that's enough to kick off discussion. We hope Our presentation was useful, and we hope that we represented the fine work of our staff well, and we look forward to a lively round of questions.
I'd like to start with one that, the integrated tax system, this is yet another example of a very high price, high ticket item that is now coming to the council as almost a must-do urgent matter, but it's almost $10 million in terms of commitment. CBO recommended $1.4 million in terms of one time only, and then they made sort of the unique statement that this should also come back as first claim on any discretionary ongoing resources. Can you give us a sense of the urgency, and can you also speak to the way we are managing these big ticket technology must-haves that seem to come to the council at the very last minute as hair on fire imperatives?
So I'll start with the answer to that question, and I apologize in advance, but I do have a prop to evidence what we're dealing with. This is the city's current tax collection platform. You'll recognize this, I believe it's from the 80s. This is what we're trying to move to. We are a generation behind in terms of the platform that we are using today. It is supported by a consultant, a single individual, who's announced to us that he plans to retire. And it's, I think, heightens the city's risk profile to put so much weight on a single system that is as old as it is. I appreciate the observation about bringing it to you as a must-have. If it's not replaced, we increase the city's risk profile for every day that we don't take steps to address it. Should we have been looking at this 10 years ago? Yes.
So I guess my question is this. What are we doing differently now to make sure that we're planning for whatever's going to be necessary 10 years from now?
And what we've done in BRFSS is set up a technology reserve fund, even in advance of these discussions, to fund replacement of other technologies that we are currently using in BRFS. We use a technology in accounting to produce the CAFR. We use other technologies in procurement to facilitate online bidding and management of the city's procurement process. We've already set aside funds for those systems and the eventual replacement of those systems. And we've already talked to CBO about potentially using those funds to make the 5% cash commitment to the ITS rather than one-time funds, because we should be stepping up and making our first effort ourselves. We are talking to other bureaus about setting aside reserves, and that was the Financial Policy 2.03 on financial planning that we talked about last week, about the need to set aside reserves for what will be inevitable eventualities.
Okay, thank you, and I love the phone. That's
Great visual, yes.
Somewhere the Water Bureau director is lamenting that he's lost the prop battle this year to the CFO.
I remember taking that. Well, my husband had one that we would take on when we go out for lunch. So on the integrated tax system, it's going to cost a total of about $30 million and $10 million this year. So I just want to draw attention to the City Budget Office's recommendations that we not move to a percentage of increased revenues instead of a set payment for the vendor, and that we look at adding the debt service to the current appropriation level with all the general fund bureaus sharing the impacts. And I do agree that using some of our contingency this year for the 1.4 million, just fund that one time so that we really look at the debt service as well as how are we going to pay this massive amount of money. It's clear to me that we need this, even before your prop. The question is, how can we pay for it in the most cost-effective way?
We are, and I'll share with everybody, we're posting the notice of intent to award today. This concludes a multi-month, people effort in identifying the vendor who we believe can help bring this project to fruition. Once the protest period concludes, we will start the negotiation process, and we have advisors working with us so that we are going to negotiate hard.
Every year I make, well, many years I make the point that when we look at the overhead model, there's very little input from the council into what that overhead rate is. And I know there's a committee, but I think that's should be something that in the future should be put up as a budget decision. Similarly with the blended rate model, we adopted a downtown blended rate in 2015, which will go into effect in 2021. And the issue here is what goes into that blended rate, and we don't have a policy or an agreement about what is a reasonable shared expense across all downtown office spaces and what should be specific to a building or even to an individual tenant. And I agree with the CBO's recommendation to have the Office of Management and Finance convene a work group to discuss these, to develop formal policies regarding what should and shouldn't go into the blended rate. Because I think that, you know, this, I was a little irked by your slide that showed the relatively modest 47% increase in the general fund funding for the Bureau, because you get overhead funding as well. So that's not the overall amount that the Office of Management and Finance gets. Similarly, it showed a massive decrease in transportation, but that's just because their general fund is such a small amount of the budget. So I think if we're looking at resources, it would be helpful to show overall resources and not just general fund resources, even though, of course, that's what we're discussing here.
Commissioner Fitz, could I address those 2 points? Or do you want to finish? Do you have others that you want to?
What's that?
I don't mean to interrupt you. Do you want to finish a list, or do you want, I would like to address those 2 points. Okay. So on the blended rate, we fully agree, and we had already been having discussions about a formal policy on the blended rate, and we agree with the Budget Office's recommendation. We will be bringing together a group that will make a recommendation on what is included and what is not, and we think that is a wise approach. So thank you for raising that. In terms of the resource question, we would very much like to engage in a discussion with council and bureaus around the other revenue streams that support the Office of Management and Finance, because we fully believe that much of the rate discussion, the overhead discussion, even if it is irksome to many people, including Bureau financial managers, we don't have a very sophisticated model when we augment capital improvement plans or expand services on what the hydraulics are for how we actually fund the internal services. It's been very difficult for me in my first 2 years to understand some of the rationale of we expand services for transportation, water, sewer, environmental services. Sorry, Director Jordan and the team, environmental services. And yet we don't have a very clear connection to what it's going to take to actually procure those resources, hire people, and it's too much guesswork on the rates. So we have a lot of work to do to make that more clear, and I agree with you that some people do feel like we have question marks about that. We agree with that.
Yeah, and I think we're agreeing. I was just about to also make the point that the council has a habit of adopting new policies without really looking at or considering how we're going to pay for the staff that are going to implement them. And so, you know, in the legislature, they've got the Ways and Means Committee where you have a good idea, but then you go and say, how are you going to pay for it? And I think that we ought to be looking at how do we do that. I mean, the Clean Energy Fund got it right. They set up the staffing in advance. In some of the other things that we've done, like the accessory dwelling unit waiver and the rental registration, absolutely great policies, and with major cost implications. And so certainly as we move forward, as we're looking at massive cuts to Portland Parks and Recreation, we ought to be mindful of, you know, having general fund available for other things. I do want to just finally comment on Director Summers-McGee talking about the centralized accommodation fund. And the City Budget Office recommends not doing that, but allowing bureaus to ask for it from contingency. Perhaps we could earmark the $500,000 in contingency so that the bureaus know that it's there. Maybe it doesn't need to go into the Bureau of Human Resources, although they do have the expertise and are developing more and more of it into exactly what kind of accommodations does a person who is blind, a person who is deaf, a person with any number of different disabilities. Especially small bureaus, it's very hard to develop that expertise when you've only got, 11 people total. To be able to have that expertise across all the range of disabilities is really unrealistic. And so I would suggest that's what we do.
Nick, do you have a question?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Excellent presentation. A couple of comments and a couple of questions. I worked with HR this fall on a national recruitment for a leader. We hit the jackpot. The feedback we got from Adina Long, who will be presenting later today, you'll have a chance to meet her, she's the new director of the Parks Bureau, was that the city really extended itself to her. Kind of, she viewed it as Cadillac service. She was being wooed, and she found the city very responsive to the concerns she raised. And she's not atypical of talent we're looking for. She lived in another city. She has a life partner that has another career. These things are complicated, but when we're looking for the best possible talent, we have to go recruit. We just can't put advertisements in a couple local newspapers and think that there's going to be a pool that materializes. So our experience in doing a national search for the new Parks Director was very positive, so I want to acknowledge that and thank HR. And I also want to just say that ever since the mayor announced that we were going to take Project Search citywide, I'm proud that we're continuing to expand opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities at the city. And I hope at some point we become, excuse me, a model employer for people with intellectual disabilities. Jennifer Cooperman, I have a question for you. Two questions. One is, in the PowerPoint, you're listed as the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services, but your tag is the Chief Financial Officer. Have we overcomplicated this thing? I mean, you are the CFO, correct?
Yes.
And as the CFO, you lead the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services, correct?
Yes.
And we specifically carved out a dual report for the CFO. In other words, you report to the CAO, but you also report to the council. So if there's a disagreement, the council always gets the benefit of your thinking. Has the dual report, in your judgment, worked as contemplated?
Yes.
Okay, that's very helpful. And Tom Reinhardt.
Did you have to say that because Tom was sitting there and we're sitting here? No.
Commissioner, you can excuse me at any point of the questioning.
Well, it's an unusual situation where we write into code that you can go above your boss and directly to the council, but it was a hallmark of the kind of independence we wanted the CFO to have, that we did not want the CFO to withhold information from the council if there was a good faith disagreement within OMF, and that's was very important to the council. And then Tom Reinhardt, I appreciate that we're in the early stages of a brand new budget process. And we're all trying to figure out how this is going to work. I think the early reviews are mixed, although I will tell you from my experience, following the guidance that we agreed to this time has been very sobering. I've learned some interesting things, and it has had the effect of almost requiring us to do zero-based budgeting, take things down to the studs, rebuild them by program area, and better understand how we fund our work, and it's been very illuminating. But the thing I want to ask you, Tom, because you and the CBO and the mayor, who have been sort of preaching the gospel of this new system, we're also concerned about a lack of discipline on the council in terms of one-time and ongoing asks. And so this year, we institute a policy that requires the commissioner in charge to issue a direction to develop. And the idea was to make each of us accountable for those asks and not just have the Bureau put in lots of asks. Well, as I mentioned the other day, we're up to $100 million in ongoing and one-time asks and almost $20 million in ongoing asks. In your Bureau alone, you're asking for almost $3 million of ongoing and over $21 million of one-time. And I understand that that includes capital spending for the tax platform. But what I'd like to ask you is, given that our intent was to tighten our belt, and given that we went into this budget process knowing we had very little one-time and ongoing money to disperse, what is your take on the disconnect between what we intended around directions to develop and what has actually happened? Because the ultimate effect of this is we've killed a forest of trees to create documents from CBO saying we're not funding things because we have asked that absolutely dwarf the amount of resources we have. I thought directions to develop was one way we were going to get on top of that. What's your preliminary thinking about how it's working?
I'll give you more than preliminary thinking, Commissioner. I really appreciate the question. I believe firmly that the program offer model in the first year has begun a very productive transformation in the way we think about the budget. I sat in this room with you and others in which we discussed in the budget, recommended budget changes, a number of different governance models to directions to develop. We could not come to agreement around the gentleperson's agreement between council or some type of sieve through CBO or a review committee of CAO, CBO, and others around what was viable and what wasn't. I believe we have a governance and structural issue on that input. And what we have really is directions to develop become sort of interest and markers for future budgets, and in as much as they are current budget asks. We have not overcome that obstacle yet, and that is just, based on discussions I've had with people, that we need to be able to figure out within our budget outlook in the next several years, what does council want in terms of clear priorities with limited resources instead of what you have described?
Well, I'm glad that you just said what you said around certain of these asks are designed to highlight things that are down the road. So the idea is let's salt the discussion because hopefully over the next 5 years we'll have more money to carve up and want to put down a marker. It may actually be worth our while to come up with different categories of asks. The person who puts something in for purposes of highlighting a need but knows they're not going to get funding this year might want to call it something else so that it's not competing with actually the stuff that's urgently in need. And I think as this process has gone forward, and each of us are doing our budget cheat sheets, I think we're aware that there's some really compelling asks
Agreed.
In this budget.
Yeah.
Stuff that has to be done this year.
And Commissioner Hardesty, from experience of the council, the mayor with experience at Multnomah County, the mayor from Multnomah County, and others who have had different budget processes, I think may recognize many jurisdictions have a budget review committee. We have a lot of talented directors that will help with trade-offs and that they can get beyond their own interest and say, for example, that the Bureau of Transportation, the next highest and best use of the next dollar possibly should go to transportation. That's just one example. We could put together a group that would give you levels of kind of city need in terms of another lens of that process. I'd be eager to put together that group. I think it would be a good step forward. I don't know if Frida or Pam or others who have experience with different budget processes want to weigh in on that, but there are different models that we could help you get a layered look at the resource constraints and where you should be investing the money.
Thank
you. Thank you for the presentation. That was great. Commissioner Fish, I was down in Salem yesterday and discovered that they've gone paperless. They just bring their laptops to committee hearings. The offices are paperless, so maybe that's something for us to think about, although the thought of staring at a screen.
Were you testifying on the lift stuff?
I was.
So I read about it. Congratulations. You testified on both bills.
I did.
You said thumbs down on the one that would preempt us and not allow us to, and then I read your actual quote about anti-consumer, anti-environment. It was spot on.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Making me blush. Director Baer, you mentioned the beta site has launched. Can you tell me which bureaus and offices had the good fortune of participating in that beta?
Actually, all bureaus are participating in the beta and the development of the content online. So it's actually out there right now. I think the website is www.beta.portland.gov.
Okay.
So everybody can see it. I'm glad to share the link out with everybody. So you just click on it, makes it easier.
I have been anxiously awaiting that the whole time I've been here, so I'm very excited about that. Just a couple quick comments. One, the accommodation fund. I want to thank Director Summers McGee for bringing that directive forward and for her comments. We're not doing a good enough job. The ADA has been in existence for a quarter of a century, and we are really lagging behind. One question I have is, do we have anyone who oversees compliance, whether that's someone in HR or someone in the city attorney's office?
It's complaint oriented.
And it's
Yes.
also in the Office of Equity and Human Rights.
It is, okay.
That's kind of the part of what we're looking at in terms of the staffing for people for accommodations and ADA compliance. So we'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay,
So
great.
BHR's is internally focused, the Office of Equity and Human Rights is externally focused for the public, but the accommodations, as far as who's checking to make sure that we're doing it well or there are no problems, is complaint-based.
I assumed that because that's been my experience everywhere I've gone, including with the school district, who used to have a really amazing compliance officer and then eliminated that position, and it went to an attorney employed by the district, which I found to be really inadequate and not serving the interests of people with legitimate complaints. So I'm intrigued to learn more about how it works at the city, and I just want to put out my support for this accommodation fund. The other thing that I want to touch on is 311. I mean, we're at this moment where we're looking at massive investments in updating software. 311 is no exception. I don't see how we move forward efficiently and effectively without making these investments. And 311 in particular, we're talking about doing this community survey. Well, we're going to find out that the community is once again really unhappy with the level of service and the access to the city and to resources. And that is due in no small part to our failure to deliver information and to make it easy to connect with the city. So I don't know how we make any progress on that front. We may be already serving some of the needs that are going to be identified in this survey, but nobody knows because there is no easy way to access this information. And we also don't have a communications office, but I'm going to save that one for next year. So I want to also lend my support to that project and say that we are delivering some of these services in an incredibly inefficient and expensive way, bureau by bureau and office by office. And I would support looking at what's already, the FTE that exists across bureaus except for utilities, which we can't redirect.
Oh, yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Well, Commissioner Fisher or Fritz has something.
There's 100 people in the Customer Service Department in the Water Bureau, so there is a discussion. And I just have to say, I'm leaping in because I'm so excited about your support for 311.
Yeah, okay.
I've been trying to get this done since 2011, and thanks to your team for really taking it to the next level. But I do think there's ways to involve staff who are already answering a lot of customer service questions, as long as it's proportionate to the Water Bureau questions versus...
Yeah, that was a question I put out there because of how we're restricted with ratepayer dollars, whether or not we could kind of track how,
Well, as long as it's not disproportionate, that the Water Bureau staff would be perhaps helping out with other questions, but then General Fund would help answer Water Bureau questions and in the right proportion is how I see it happening.
Yeah.
Definitely very interested in that.
Great. All right.
Commissioner Daly, thank you very much. We agree. We think a 311 program would add tremendous value to the city. Over the last 5 years, we've had several fits and starts. We do have some alternate proposals that we've put forward for the CBO recommendation. I'm happy to talk to you more about that offline, but we do have some scaled-down proposals in lieu of the big, full package.
Thank you.
I also want to say that I think the 311 will be a game changer as it relates to customer service. I was horrified to find out we had 147 information lines at the City of Portland when I got here. And unless you know somebody's middle initial or know how their name is spelled, it is almost impossible to find the right person to address the right issue. And so, but it leads me to a bigger question, which is how dysfunctional our technology is here at the City of Portland. Overall, no disrespect, Jeff. It's like go to any bureau and find out that bureau can't talk to another bureau, or this data system is totally antiquated because only one person knows how to work it and they're about to retire. It's like, so my question is, what's our plan to do a citywide technology conversation so that we have people actually buying technology that knows what we need, as compared to having people who are purchasers as compared to the people who actually use the systems, right? It is one of my biggest frustrations here is how antiquated. I mean, when you gave me a Dell computer, I knew I was headed into the dark ages, right? What's the plan to actually get us on track so that we actually are moving forward with not just 311, which is absolutely vital for the public, but we can't even talk to each other in-house. I mean, it's pretty sad.
Commissioner, the first steps we've taken to address exactly what you've described in much more articulate terms than I would describe, thank you, is to actually have a technology work plan. So for the past 2 years, we now have an annual work plan that rationalizes and orders and sequences the major efforts that we're doing as a city. So under Jeff's leadership and the team's leadership, they've taken what was really an unwieldy and outrageous list of capital improvement projects and linking bureaus together and software upgrades and subscription renewals. And we work with a group of your leaders from different bureaus to craft a plan. I chair that group. I consider it just the first step, but we've really needed buy-in and ownership and organization so that we prioritize together for the council what needs to be done next. I'm happy to walk you through that. We have what I call the messy solar system slide that shows all the different software systems in the city of Portland. We have now a plan for many of the most difficult lifts to be taken care of, but you are right, and I will let CTO Bear take the Dell computer question, since I can't address that.
Thank you, Tom. So we've standardized on the Dell laptop, desktop. It's partly because it's a cost issue. We are also working on how do we allow in Mac or iOS devices into the environment. So we are working on that actively. We need to stand up a support center that we can provide support either internally or through like the Apple Bar product that you can go and get tech support. So we are working on that.
I have a question for Director Summers-McGee. Hello. One question and one comment. The question is, how was the compensation study conducted for the, I understand, managers? And the concern is that on this comment that the Bureau should be evaluated in relation to each other's performance, I understand that it's a matter of budget constraint, and I'm very familiar with that part. But I am concerned that just increased the risk of inequality. I mean, in a way, it's competing for who's liked better from their supervisor, and this is a human business. This is subjective.
So restate the question for me, just so I can make sure I'm tracking it properly.
I would like to understand how the study was conducted for the compensation study. So in the classification and compensation study.
Right. So are you referring to the paid equity study, or are you referring to the classification and compensation study, where we basically took...
Classification and compensation study.
So the ClassCom study was a study that began before I started in 2013. I believe it was 2013 when it began, essentially to review the way that the city had our compensation structured initially. We had one classification for every 3 employees who were non-rep at the City of Portland. which is a worst practice. That in and of itself allowed for certain people to be able to be placed inside their own classification and then be set apart from other people doing the exact same work and be paid differently, oftentimes at a higher rate. So we focused on the class comp study to actually establish consistency and equity and to stop people from being able to game the system. I like you, and so I'm going to establish a new classification for you by saying that this line of work is dissimilar than anyone else in the city of Portland. So the new class comp study effectively was arguably the most equity-oriented program that we've done all year long, because no longer could a BFF be paid at a higher rate without there really being any way to substantiate that the work is all that dissimilar from the person sitting right next to them. Does that answer your question? And if
So,
not-
no, the question was, how was it conducted?
So we conducted it with external contractors and internal internal staff. It was a very lengthy process. It took several years, but it also, because the class comp team is only 4 employees, we didn't have the bandwidth to be able to do the day-to-day operations and do a deep classification and compensation analysis. So we subbed it out. The folks looked at position descriptions. Through this study, we actually established for the first time in the history of the city of Portland, position descriptions for you to actually articulate what your job looks like, generally speaking, and then getting your manager, supervisor to sign off on that. The external contractors then compared all of those position descriptions to see which ones were similar. They submitted them to us. We reviewed it and said, we don't think that this is as similar as you believe it is, or spot on. So that was the way that the process unfolded, and we probably were at the biggest when I started, we were at the biggest analysis portion of the process. So I played an integral role in that analysis.
I have a follow-up question for you. So it sounds like there's a lot of maybe new data tracking happen, but I wonder if you're tracking specific to bureaus or divisions, turnover rates, retention, particularly retention of employees of color, and whether in addition to, it looked like there's some good investment happening in training kind of citywide, but whether there's investment happening specifically in management training citywide.
Such a great question. Thank you very much, Andrea. So we track attrition data citywide. It's on the dashboard as well, and we break it out by background. So you can say, and track what were our folks who identify as having a disability, what the numbers were per division inside each bureau, what the recruitments look like, and then be able to track the migration patterns of those individuals. As far as training is concerned, we're actually launching in 2019 a citywide, just a refresh of manager training, direct anyone who's managing people. What does it mean to be a manager of human beings at the city of Portland? What are the best practices? How do you get biases out of all of the processes and systems that you are employing and deploying throughout your bureau? How do you get out of your own way, right? So in 2019, we're going to launch that citywide. Again, I highlighted that we made a lot of modifications in 2018 because I knew that there would be more requests for more modifications in 2019, and that was an important one. Doing the refresh, reset with manager training, we just didn't have the infrastructure at that time to do it. Now we do.
I've got a few questions. I'm going to bounce around, but I'll start with you. Okay, first I want to compliment you on streamlining the recruitment. I worked with EPAP Advocate, and it was wonderful to see that we had timelines, notifications, so the applicant knew exactly when we were going to make the selection. So they had that in their head when they were applying. I'm also train the trainer. School districts have been using it for years. Of course, we've got all those educators to tap into, but it is a great way to save money when you want to do across your entity, all your bureaus training. In regard to working with high schools, I've asked this because it's been mentioned before how they're working with all the high schools. I happen to have a tap-in, being on the Davis Douglas School Board with our high school, and the assistant principal who is in charge of career technical education. Unfortunately, the only bureau that has worked with David Douglas has been the Parks Bureau. She has not been approached by any other bureau, and we have the most diverse high school in the state with quite a few, probably more career technical education programs than any other high school because of our 3,000 student body. So just putting that out there, because I did recommend that it should be funneled in through HR to make all the contacts, because every high school has a different programs and focused on different things, and it would save the bureaus a lot of time trying to start building that pipeline. East Side presence. I heard that the Water Bureau moved to the east side. I think it was interstate, if I understood it right. That's not anywhere near the majority of the population. So when you choose an east side presence, it should be centrally located, because if you're just putting it just across the river, you might as well have it downtown. Just a comment. And technology, I was reading about INET, that the IGA with Comcast is coming to an end. Is this what you're talking about with the fiber optics, to develop something differently? Because I know our public entities use that kind of connection.
Yes, the INET franchise agreements, they expire the December of 2021. And so we were working to find out what are some alternatives, what are some options for extending the franchise agreements, because we do have a lot of people who are on that, including MESD, Portland Public Schools, David Douglas School District, City of Gresham, that are part of the INET system. So we're working actively, and that is part of it.
Okay, and the other thing is in regard to the integrated tax system. You have an IGA with Multnomah County, and I would assume there's some kind of built-in escalation with those contracts, because I would assume that, I'm not saying there is, but assume that, is there a built-in so that they are actually paying for the services we're providing?
So the current IGA expires June 30th of 2019, and we're actively engaged in discussions with the county about putting a new IGA in place. We are talking with them. They've been involved in the evaluation of the ITS proposals. They've sat through all the vendor conversations. They are aware of the challenges and the benefits and the additional costs. And we've been very clear with them that our services going forward are going to reflect the cost of a new system.
I want to add one comment on those two questions you asked, Frida. I've directed our team to get a lot better in the next year on producing policy papers with choices for council on these complex issues. Both Ernie INET, the IGA with Multnomah County, these issues are multifaceted. They have institutional history, and there are options that it's very difficult to daylight for council in a budget process that's filled with lots of competing choices that they have. So we're developing a capacity to produce easier to understand policy choices for the council throughout the year on these complex projects. I appreciate you mentioning that.
Well, I know about institutional knowledge, having been on the board for 28 years, but I'm a strong believer in that and understanding it. But you have to, when you're moving forward, you have to think to the future. So just because something's been done in the past doesn't mean we have to keep doing it.
So I want to make sure we give Dr. Smith an opportunity to speak before we take a break.
No real questions, just comments, and we gave quite a bit of feedback yesterday, and so most of what you all have been asking, I think, was covered.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, so.
Very good. Any burning questions, Pam?
Well, I think it's burning.
Sure.
I would be remiss if I didn't support Frida's comments about CTE in the high schools. And as you know, Portland Public has 11 high schools that has CTE programs, and so I would say those are other opportunities, and I know they're really working on, even though I'm not on the board anymore, they're really working on building that program up. So I encourage you all to use that as well. My other comment has more to do with the budget process, and this is my third year on doing this. Much easier this year than it was the first year, although the changes have come about, which I like. I think the changes are good. Again, this is the first year, so just a couple comments about them. You know, as citizens, we only are exposed to this 2 or 3 months out of the year, and so some of the work that you all are doing, we don't really have an opportunity to hear much about that. So if there were updates that we could have throughout the year with just kind of what's happening in the city, or because sometimes it's hard to get information about what's going on all the different projects. And then the other part, I think, goes along with what Commissioner Fish was saying with regard to the budgets and how much you have to, I guess the good part about this is that you actually have some money that you're trying to spread around. Coming from the school districts, you know, we've been in the 10 to 40% budget cuts, so for years and years and years, and so I'm very familiar with what it means to cut from a budget, but to add budget is kind of a good thing. And the city has money. But the thing that I'm not seeing is you were talking about priorities, and I think about the one that we see a lot as we're here is equity, which I'm very supportive of, and I think that that's great that we're hearing from Dr. Smith on every bureau about what they're doing with equity. But what are the other priorities of the city? I'm thinking of homelessness because we have a lot that we're talking about there, transportation, some others. But I don't see, as we're going through each one of these budgets, how that particular bureau is tying to those priorities, except for the equity one, which is great. So I guess the question for me is, what are the top 5 priorities? And every budget should come from each of the bureaus should come back and say how they're supporting that. And that's why they need the money, not that they have a new project or something else that they want to do. So that's, and I think the other thing I'd like to see is what are the collaboration between the bureaus in coming up with that. So when you talk about the city's priorities and what the real needs are, and I think you mentioned one, Tom, around a collaboration where a bureau would come in and say, well, clearly this is much more important than what we have. Or we could use this at the same time this other bureau is using it. So those are just kind of the, and when you do the policy work sheets for the, we would like those as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation. It was really great.
We'll take Commissioner Daly, and then we'll take a brief break.
I just neglected to commend Directors Summers, McGee, and HR for their improvements in the recruitment process. I just want to acknowledge that and thank you. As one of my biggest frustrations with BDS, we were operating in a really competitive market and we were losing top candidates because it was taking so long to hire them. And it's a huge improvement, and good job.
Thanks for the opportunity to present.
Very good. Why don't we take a break till 10 minutes after, and then we'll come back and we'll hear from the Office of the City Auditor. We're in recess. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, and Community Budget Advisors, City Staff. I am City Auditor Mary Hull Caballero. With me today is Joshua McNeil, who was the first ever Business Operations Manager in the Auditor's Office. I'd like to also acknowledge that Mary McWilliams, who serves on my Auditor's Advisory Council, is present, and as are members of my management team. Given that we've got some new faces around the table, I'm going to start with some background about the City Auditor's Office, how it fits in city government, and a recent charter amendment that should inform our discussion today. The City Auditor is the 6th elected official in Portland. Its mission is to promote accountability and transparency among city bureaus, which are led by my fellow elected colleagues. My job, at its most basic, is to keep an eye on them in their executive branch capacity. The mayor and commissioners also have legislative and budget-setting responsibilities that the auditor is not assigned. This infographic depicts recent relevant history. It shows how the auditor functionally had been pushed down in the hierarchy and treated like a bureau instead of an elective office, even though Portland has had a charter-mandated city auditor since 1868 and an elected auditor since 1891. You'll find the auditor at the bottom of the heap on the left, below commissioners in charge and 3 bureaus. This was especially troublesome at budget time. Mayors would announce their spending priorities, and the auditor's office could never compete with paving streets, hiring police officers, or increasing shelter beds or affordable housing units. While we can help the city achieve those things by shining a light where it could be more efficient, effective, and equitable, the auditor's office never really fit the letter of the budget criteria set forth by mayors and used by the city budget office to make recommendations about whether requests should be funded. In 2017, I proposed and City Council agreed to refer a charter amendment to the ballot for voters to decide if they wanted the auditor to be independent from bureaus and their commissioners in charge. This graphic depicts the concept put before the voters. And 86.41% of them reiterated that, yes, that is what they wanted in their city government. The charter as amended says that mayor and council should consider the auditor's priorities and duties when setting the auditor's budget rather than their own priorities. This language clarifies that the budget priorities and duties of the elected auditor are equal to those of city council, even though they are different. So what are the auditor's duties and priorities? My duties are to audit, investigate, and record. I also manage an office of 54.5 full-time equivalent employees with the assistance of 7 division managers and management services staff. Auditor duties set forth in charter are shown in gray. Other duties defined in city code are shown in light green. They are the result of council requesting and the auditor agreeing to take responsibility for them. Elected auditors also have their own priorities on which they campaign for office. These go beyond the obligation to implement charter and code obligations. As I begin my second term, my priorities remain the same as in my first term. They are to continue making equity a routine, analytical component of our assessments and operations, communicating in formats various audiences prefer, and in plain language that invites the public's interest and understanding. And I share Commissioner Hardesty's aversion to acronyms. And my third priority is to protect the independence of the auditor's office. While we advance the cause of independence with the charter amendment, there's still a bit of unfinished business to ensure the budget setting process for the auditor's office is fair to both city council and the auditor. The charter's broad language establishes a context for what the public expects, but provides no framework for how to achieve it. As with other charter sections, subsequent council action through city code and ordinances was necessary to define how charter would be implemented. I am proposing a framework today that ensures council can meet its fiduciary responsibility under state budget law and provide the auditor's office with predictable funding. The framework also mitigates 2 structural problems that put the auditor's office at a disadvantage during the budget process. The first structural issue is that it's no one's job to look out for the auditor's office when the hard decisions about what to fund and at what level are being made. The auditor is the only elected official who does not vote on budget options. The auditor's office is unique among city offices and bureaus to go through the process without a champion to fight for its resources. This puts the auditor in the unenviable position of competing for funds, knowing that $1 for the auditor's office is one commissioners cannot spend on their own priorities. The auditor's only resource is to scramble at the 11th hour to generate public pressure on city council. The auditor should not have to depend on the kindness of council members and the media to ensure the auditor's office has the appropriate resources it needs. The second structural issue is the commission form of government, which creates a conflict of interest by placing those we audit and investigate in charge of our budget. Independence in fact and perception is the bedrock of any accountability office. Having representatives of the executive branch making decisions about the auditor's budget at the line item level is an organizational impairment to my office's independence. It hurts our credibility. That's because appearance counts as much as actual interference. The budget process, as currently configured, leaves some people thinking that the city auditor's office pulls its punches because council pulls its budget strings. We don't, but I can't really prove that the accusation is without merit because city council does control important decisions within my office. What I'm going to say next went unsaid in my 4 prior budget hearings. I'm going to list examples of important work done by the auditor's office that the public values, but is bad strategy to bring up when you're asking council for additional resources. The Ombudsman alerted the public in 2016 that more than 18,000 cell phone calls to 911 got disconnected before an operator got on the line. That investigation led to a follow-up report in which the Ombudsman found that callers were left on hold much longer than the Bureau had asserted and well below acceptable national standards. The commissioner on whose watch this occurred gets a vote on whether the auditor's office can add a deputy ombudsman to our staff. Under pressure from the Department of Justice, independent police review in recent years has received resources for additional investigative positions and analytical capacity. With that new capacity, we can conduct more policy reviews, which stem from community member complaints that don't meet the criteria for officer misconduct per se, but could be addressed with improved policies. These 2 reports focused on sensitive topics of importance to our community. The example on the left assessed whether organizational barriers kept the Police Bureau from achieving its goal to diversify its workforce. We identified some gaps in the process and made recommendations for improved data collection to identify where demographic groups were falling out of Portland's hiring process. We also dissected decisions the Police Bureau made during a street protest and identified areas where policy improvements could be made to operations during such events. The commissioner on whose watch these events occurred gets a vote on whether the auditor's office can add resources to independent police review. Performance auditors usually focus on program efficiency and effectiveness. Any student of government, however, knows that you can run an efficient and effective program and end up with adverse outcomes for some groups. By adding equity analyses, our audits provide a broader landscape of findings and recommendations that can help the city avoid making or fix mistakes that hurt certain demographic groups more than others. These audit reports identified decisions by the city that contributed to the erosion of trust that government works for everyone. It's a truism that the public must have faith in its police force for the community to be safe and law enforcement to be effective. We produced 2 reports about gang enforcement that showed the Police Bureau's approach placed a disparate burden on the African American community. What's worse, the Bureau couldn't show that its tactics were effective in curbing gang violence. Choosing audit topics is the sole responsibility of the elected auditor. Mayor Wheeler and Commissioner Fish made a persuasive case, however, that we audit the city's funding of the arts through the Regional Arts and Culture Council. To their credit, they provided additional funding for the work, and their only request was that we do what we normally do in an audit, provide unvarnished findings and recommendations. What followed was the best result an auditor could hope for. City Council held a work session to discuss the results, and the Arts Council announced that it has changed its existing funding model to address historic disparities that adversely affected artists of color and small organizations. So what if Council had not responded so positively to this work? Come budget time, each member gets a vote on whether Audit Services gets funding for a new auditor position to expand its reach. Just as I can assert that my office tells it like it is, City Council members can assert but can't prove that audits and investigations don't affect their budget decisions. That's a credibility problem for both of us, and I have a budget proposal to resolve it. To put things in perspective, it's important to note that in the grand scheme of the city budget, the auditor's office is small, and our request for next fiscal year is modest. I could argue that the savings bureaus gain when they implement our recommendations more than pay for what we cost. In percentage terms, the auditor's office barely registers at 0.2% of the city budget. That's us in the lower right-hand column, the green slice of the budget pie. We are requesting a total of $11.7 million, including about $280,000 in new resources. The big ask is for a budget note to establish a budget-setting pilot to put the auditor's office on equal footing with other city elected officials. The pilot represents the framework to implement the public's expectations from the charter election. It ensures that council can meet its fiduciary obligations and provides predictable, modest funding increases for the priorities and duties of the auditor's office over a 5-year planning horizon. After researching a number of options, we identified the funding model used by the Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission, which is an independent body that reviews municipal budgets in Multnomah County before they are adopted, including Portland's. Here's how it works. The legislature sets a budget cap based on a percentage increase over 10 years, and the Tax Commission must operate below that cap. We propose using a similar concept to set the auditor's budget over the next 5 years. The funding cap would account for one-time and ongoing resources. Year-end savings from materials and services would be set aside in a fund for the auditor's use. Once accumulated funds reach $500,000, any additional savings would return to the general fund. The pilot's maximum funding cap would be the current appropriation level plus a set percentage, which will be developed for the mayor's proposed budget with the assistance of the city budget office. Exceptions to the funding cap would be permitted for sizable, unanticipated expenditures, such as legal judgments. Council would also provide additional funds when the auditor accepts expanded responsibilities at council's request or through a voter-approved charter change that requires resources to implement. Changes to the maximum funding level also may be necessary based on a December revenue forecast that reflects economic conditions that may result in substantial citywide cuts. In that context, the mayor and auditor would negotiate an appropriate funding level to be included in the mayor's proposed budget for approval by council. Any cuts to the auditor's office would be consistent with cuts experienced across the city, but only if they also apply to other elective offices. We based our recommendation for the appropriate percentage for year one on a couple of factors, which are the historical average increases in the auditor's adopted budgets and what's needed to achieve our strategic goals. Those goals for the next fiscal year are to resolve the systemic conflict over setting the auditor's budget, improve awareness of our services in underserved communities, increase our capacity for accountability and transparency. The chart shows that the average increase in the auditor's adopted budget over the past 5 years has been 5.44%. Our request for year one of the budget pilot amounts to a 2.5% increase over our current appropriation level, or just over $279,000. Over 1/3 of those new funds would address substantial risk to the city that has emerged over time in the hearings office. The increased number and complexity of cases, combined with turnover in the chief hearings officer position after decades of stability, poses a serious risk to the city. Certain case types filed with the hearings officer have increased 128% since fiscal year 2014. That increase does not include vehicle tow cases, which are paid for by the police and transportation bureaus through interagency agreements, and land use cases, which are paid for with fees collected by the Bureau of Development Services. To mitigate the risk, almost $100,000 of our $279,000 request would be used to increase an existing part-time casual hearings officer position to full-time. That amount includes budgeted salary and benefits. Having 2 full-time hearings officers will ensure that cases will be heard and decided in a timely fashion, and lagging management and operational obligations will be met. The remainder of our request includes a handful of one-time projects which are detailed in our requested budget. In conclusion, I'd like to address the somewhat deserved criticism the Auditor's Office has received for not spending funds Council has provided it. This chart is evidence that the steps I've taken internally to develop a logical spending strategy is projected to sharply reduce our underspending. We're making smarter investments linked to our strategic goals that will carry us through this pilot. For example, divisions now have integrated strategic and equity goals in addition to meeting their charter and code obligations. Managers have aligned their division budgets to those goals, and granular budgeting has been implemented in each division to ensure we are marshaling resources to our strategic priorities. I hope I have made a persuasive case to adopt and fund a 5-year budget-setting pilot that is fair to the Auditor's Office and City Council and improves our credibility with the public. We must demonstrate that the city cares about accountable and transparent government and is willing to fund it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Auditor. I really appreciate the graph showing the increasing hearings officers cases. Have you done an analysis of whether more kinds of people are being able to access those services since you led the effort to reduce the appeal fees?
We have collecting that kind of data in our equity strategic plan, and we have had some delay. Part of it is caused by the turnover that I discussed. And some of it is because it is difficult to figure out when the right time is to ask for that information, because we don't want people to think that that is a barrier to them getting into the hearings office, and we haven't quite figured out how we can go about doing that. And so I am, as I sit here today, recruiting a new chief hearings officer, and that is one of the first things on the list that have to get addressed in the hearings office, is that we understand those kinds of changes. So we can do it by case type. We're seeing a more varied case type, but as for the demographic of the people who are bringing the appeals to the hearings officer, I don't know the answer.
Do you do any kind of a satisfaction survey that you send out after a case is finished that you could perhaps add asking about demographic data?
We have not done that in the hearings office. We have done that in independent police review.
Thank you.
So I'm a little perplexed by your presentation, because it made me feel like your assumption was we could not be independent, but you could. That when we make budget decisions, it's not about what's in the best interest of the city, but rather what's in the best interest of us individually. So I'm kind of taken aback by that. You know, most people that come to the city council looking for money don't beat us up in the process.
That's right.
So I'm just trying to understand why you would take that approach.
I've never taken this approach before. I don't talk about the work my office does because it puts individual council members in a difficult position sometimes. And what you're describing is the exact problem I'm trying to resolve. We should be unfettered in the work we do to announce the findings as we find them and to make our recommendations. And we know when we do that, that there's a possibility that we pay a price at budget time. And that's what I'm describing. And as I mentioned, these are structural issues, because when I worked at the Metro Regional Government, when the elected auditor went to ask for budget resources, she was speaking to an independent legislative body. She was not speaking to the executive branch managers to get more resources for her budget. the city of Portland is just set up where you wear both hats, and it is, I think, virtually impossible for human beings to take a hat off and sit in this isolated frame of mind when you know you have these other responsibilities.
So let me just say I disagree with you. As a former legislator, I had to put lots of hats on and off. As someone who's been advocating in this city for for a few years, I've had to put lots of hats on and off. And I'm just very put off by the fact that you would come and attack as you're asking for money. I understand and I value the audits that come out of your office. Sometimes I read your audits and I'm like, whoa, I had no idea. Police Bureau is a great example. The gang enforcement report was some of the best work you did, right? But I'm just kind of surprised that an elected would decide to take that approach. So with all due respect, there was a much better way to make your case without attacking me and my colleagues. I'm done.
It was not intended as an attack. I'm trying to describe organizational problems that exist for the auditor's office at budget time.
But the issue is that the bureaus get shuffled anyway. And, you mentioned the audit of 911. Commissioner Novick was in charge in 2016. So he certainly didn't vote on your budget the next year. So I just wanted to make sure that that was in the record because it's not the same commissioner who's then voting on the budget.
So I appreciate your clarifying the position that what you're talking about is a structural issue, as opposed to speaking specifically to commissioners. You referenced the commissioner in charge of the Police Bureau during certain incidents that you audited. I was that commissioner. And my strong recollection was I supported the audits, I supported the findings, and we made appropriate investments to back that support, including taking the funding for IPR, which had been one time only, and making that ongoing funding, plus putting in a supplemental escalator for inflation and other needs. So I appreciate you making that clarification. I personally value the audit function. I read the audits often multiple times, and at least the audits that have been done of my bureaus I found to be tremendously useful. And so I hope we really are talking about the structural component and the value of the audits. I find them tremendously helpful, and I appreciate it.
I am talking about the structure because it doesn't matter who sits up at that table, the problem remains.
Thank you.
I would love to hear again your suggestion for a different method of oversight, just a quick overview of that. And then what level of oversight, if the critique is that this is an elected body without an additional level of oversight about budget decisions for your office, what suggested oversight you would see over the budgeting decisions of the auditor?
The framework that I'm proposing would establish some decision-making at the front end of this 5-year time period that I described. And it would provide a predictable, sustainable amount of money to the auditor's office. And it would essentially allow the auditor's office to join the cohort of elected officials who first and foremost are budgeted, and then the Bureau's decisions. And so the auditor's office has always been kind of taken up as a bureau. And I think what the charter election did was to clarify what the public's expectations for that are. And so what we've tried to do is to come up with a method where individual line item decisions are not being made by the people that we audit and investigate. And that's that conflict of interest that I was talking about, and that's caused by the commission form of government. And it also is a fact that no one is responsible for championing the auditor's budget. And so we are essentially left out of the process.
So I just want to understand, is the ask for sustained funding, or is the ask for a different mechanism to do line item budget reviews, or both?
The line item budget decisions would be made by the elected auditor. And what the pilot does for us is it allows us to test how that would work over time. It would provide some upfront understanding on the elected auditor's part about what resources would be coming year over year, and it would get us out of this conversation of, well, do you get a deputy ombudsman, do you get an auditor? And, you know, I just don't think that when we're asked to put that on the table with paving streets or more shelter beds or whatever, it is just not, we're not competing on that playing field. We're just not competitive. And what the charter did, the charter change did, was it essentially said, we want the auditor's office to be treated on the same plane as other elected officials.
Madam Auditor, I have just a question. I'm going to be interested in thinking more about the pilot and how it might work, but let's say the mayor proposes this year in his budget that everybody that gets general fund support takes a 1% cut. And he balances his budget by treating everybody the same. So regardless, everybody takes a 1% cut, and that includes the auditor's office. Would you say under those circumstances that there is still a concern about conflict of interest?
If you weren't taking the cut.
Pardon me?
If you weren't taking that one.
If one of us wasn't, but I'm just the hypothetical I'm presenting is that every single general fund bureau is told they have to take a 1% cut, and that's how he balances his budget, and that includes the auditor's office. Would you have the same concern about structure and conflict of interest if every bureau was treated the same?
If the other elected officials opted out of that system and my office was treated to a 1% cut, I would object to that.
If they opted out? Yeah. I'm trying to make it as easy as possible and say that, I'll go one step further. The mayor's proposed budget says everybody takes a 1% cut. Council adopts that budget, and that includes the auditor's office and every bureau that receives general fund support. Under those circumstances, do you still have the same concern about structure and conflict?
Yes, because the way the framework that I described would be set up is that the cuts that should be brought to the auditor's office should reflect some sort of economic downturn. There should be some external reason that is causing that. If the mayor is saying, I want a 1% cut across the board, it could be because he wants to open more shelter beds, and that's a policy choice by council. And the charter says that you're supposed to set the auditor's budget based on the auditor's duties and responsibilities. And so I would object to that. If every elected official's office was going to cut their budget, and every bureau is going to cut its budget, which is what I'm suggesting could occur, that the downturn could be so drastic that there are substantial citywide cuts, the auditor's office would be in those cuts as well.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Great. Dr. Smith?
Just in the materials that you shared, just an appreciation for sort of a breakdown of what's happening in your office in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender as we're kind of talking about diversification of our workforce. So thank you for providing that.
Great. Thank you, Madam Auditor.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
One more, 2 minutes.
For what? Okay, we'll take a 2-minute break, and then we'll hear from Parks and Recreation.
Well, thank you, Mayor. Colleagues and citizen budget commission, budget advisors, and members of the public, it's my pleasure to introduce the Parks and Recreation presentation this morning. When I became Parks Commissioner in September, my first priority was a national search for a new director. Well, we hit the jackpot. Director Adina Long is an outstanding addition to the Parks team, and we hope that she will continue to lead the Bureau for many years into the future. My next priority was the budget, working with new Finance Director Claudio Campuzano and his team. This year, the Mayor's new budget process required us to think about the Bureau in a new way and to build the budget literally from the ground up. In doing so, the Parks team discovered that the Bureau's unsustainable business model had reached a breaking point. The Bureau has been running at a deficit for years as costs have risen faster than revenues. Next year, Parks faces a $6.3 million gap. The Independent City Budget Office has confirmed this and advised that the previous practice of patching the hole with one-time strategies is no longer sustainable. Today, the Bureau will present a balancing option that strives to close the gap while protecting the community's core values. I want to be honest, however, and acknowledge there are no easy fixes here. Every implication of this proposal is painful, especially with layoffs, program cuts, and closures. Let's talk for a moment about next steps. Our goal is to close the gap and to stabilize the Bureau, to implement the transition with one-time resources, which is the bulk of what our asks are in this budget, and to work together to build a vision for the long-term future of our park system and to plan for a sustainable way to fund it. Thank you very much, and now it's my honor to introduce the new director of Portland Parks and Rec, who's been on the job about 4 weeks, Adina Long. And Adina, thank you for the act of faith in accepting this position, and we're delighted to welcome you to the Budget Forum.
Thank you, Commissioner Fish, and thank you, Mayor, Council, community members, and the City Budget Office for the opportunity to discuss Portland Parks and Recreation's budget today. My arrival comes at a turning point for the organization. We've long been served by a robust planning framework for our long-term vision, strategic, and racial equity plans. All of these plans are due for a refresh, giving us the opportunity to re-examine where we are and where we want to go. As I've discovered in my first 4 weeks, we have amazing passion and ambition in the form of committed staff and engaged stakeholders. But we also have challenges. I look forward to working with my team, with council, and the community to address these challenges and map a path toward a sustainable financial future to deliver cherished park services. Equity is central to this work. We have focused on ending disparities and enhancing our programming using racial equity best practices. While there is still work to do, the results are clear. Our workforce is more reflective of the Portland community at 29% people of color. That's up from 18% just 5 years ago. Our programs like Parks for New Portlanders and Summer Free for All continue to expand our reach across the city and are more culturally responsive than ever. And with the opportunity to build more parks, we focused on equity in contracting. Equity will inform how we address upcoming challenges and opportunities in both the near and long term. As we move forward on this visioning work, I'm committed to making sure our aspirations are grounded in a resource plan that is achievable. That's why we're focusing on 3 foundational bodies of work: a financial sustainability plan, service level studies for parks and community centers, and a cost recovery policy to re-examine our fees. These are 3 sustainability challenges and funding shortfalls in the Parks and Recreation system: capital maintenance, operations and maintenance, and an operating gap based on our program fee dependence. Now, Claudio will give you a brief overview of the budget and then focus on the details of these challenges.
Thank you, Director Long. The Parks and Recreation requested budget for fiscal year 1920 totals $265 million across 8 funds. These include the Capital Fund, enterprise funds like the Portland International Raceway Fund and Golf, grants, and our primary operating fund, the General Fund. Today we are going to focus on our operational budget, which consists primarily of general fund and fees we charge for service. This operational budget totals $92.5 million after proposed reductions for fiscal year 1920. Consistent with the mayor's new budget process, we took the opportunity to rebuild our budget line by line. This new approach helped us bring new clarity. As Director Long noted, we have 3 sustainability challenges. The first challenge, capital maintenance, is about taking care of what we have, old and new, so that our assets can keep delivering on the promise to the community. Capital maintenance is significantly underfunded, but as a city, we've been making strides to address it. With council's support, we've increased our investment through the city's capital set-aside policy, the Mayor's Build Portland initiative, the Parks Replacement Bond, ADA funding at $1 million per year to address barriers, and most recently, council directed the Bureau to ask for $500,000 each year for additional ongoing resources to fund major maintenance. Through these efforts, we're repairing playgrounds and community centers in neighborhoods that haven't seen investment for decades and providing ADA access to park sites across the city. But as you can see, the funding shortfall between what we do invest and what we should invest continues. Closing that shortfall will require a long-term plan and long-term persistence in pursuing it. In fiscal year 1920, we've requested an increase in major maintenance in accordance with last year's budget note. We've also made several capital set-aside requests, including over $16 million in critical repairs and energy efficiency upgrades. But taking care of what we have is only part of the picture. Our second challenge is related to growth of the system and the associated operations and maintenance needs. 1 in 5 Portland households do not have access to a park or natural area within a half mile. In East Portland, it's 2 in 5 that don't have access. In the last 5 fiscal years, the city has seen an upswing in development resulting in more than $140 million in park system development charges. With this funding, we've added park capacity throughout the city, including projects like the new Gateway Discovery and Lewitt View parks in East Portland. But with growth comes responsibility. In order to maintain safe and sustainable parks for our community, the system needs funding to operate, maintain, and eventually repair and rebuild these assets. Council has recognized this and passed a financial policy that requires a funding plan for these costs and has been consistent in allocating resources for that purpose. Based on our capital plan this year, we requested over $900,000 in ongoing general fund, and in each year over the following 4 years, the park system will need an additional $1.2 to $1.5 million. We project that the park system will need over about $6 million more ongoing funding over the next 5 years as new assets come online. Moving forward with our capital work without secured funding for operations and maintenance represents considerable risk and a future funding gap. Specifically, failing to fund new operations and new ongoing operations and maintenance puts at risk the Bureau's plans to bring equity to East Portland and will require further cuts. And finally, the third challenge is an operating gap caused by our business model. While operations are largely funded by general fund discretionary, we are also heavily reliant on revenues. For every dollar in cost, 73 cents comes from the general fund and 27 cents needs to be generated from our program fees, permits, and more. In recreation, the balance is 50-50. We must earn 50 cents of every dollar from our patrons. This dependence on revenue generation means that in order to create a balanced budget, revenue increases need to keep pace with cost increases. This hasn't happened, largely due to our responsibility to keep our programs affordable and accessible. Meanwhile, we are seeing higher costs in healthcare, cost of living adjustments, PERS, utilities, and more. Parks and Recreation's requested budget for next year includes the mayor's direction for a 1% cut and closing the Bureau's gap. Previously, we have used one-time strategies during the fiscal year like hiring freezes to balance the budget. This practice preserved some programs while at the same time weakening others. The projected budget gap at $6.3 million for next fiscal year is now too large for one-time strategies. Additionally, if we do not receive the requested ongoing operations and maintenance funding, this structural gap would grow to $7.2 million, and the park system service level would decline, or we would need to look for further reductions and realignments. So now I'll pass it back to Director Long for our fiscal year 1920 budget request and how we propose to address these challenges.
Thanks, Claudio. As Claudio said, our budget gap is $6.3 million. To bring our budget into balance, we will need to make changes to our programs, our services, and our staff. When we cut programming, it impacts our ability to generate revenues, so we must cut expenses even further to make up for that loss in revenue. Recreation's high dependence on fees means that the Recreation Division is the most deeply affected. We are making budget balancing recommendations, including reductions, with guidance from our Budget Advisory Committee's priorities of equity, safety, maintenance, and long-term financial sustainability. In addition, we leaned heavily on what we have learned from the budget equity tool, past budget processes, and other data. I do want to acknowledge our reality. In some cases, our values are affected. With the depth of the reductions before you today, I want to begin by thanking the City Budget Office and Mayor Wheeler for the additional time they allowed us for our staff and the BAC to work through this proposal. Now let's walk through the proposal division by division. The Land Stewardship Division is responsible for daily park maintenance, natural areas, sports fields, and more. With 94% of Portlanders reporting use of our parks, this work is centered on livability and long-term sustainability of our system. And with significant cuts to the division in recent years, we are currently at minimum staffing for managing the system. Our proposal reduces funding for mowing non-athletic fields and for materials and services. We also propose eliminating transit mall planter maintenance, which we aim to transition to a partner. The Assets and Development Division is responsible for managing the Bureau's planning, capital programs, asset management, and park and facility repair. While a significant portion of this division's staffing is funded by capital projects, it also receives some general fund support, particularly for the maintenance and repair function that's based out at Mount Tabor Yard. We aimed to keep Central Services team whole as we continue to struggle with a significant work order backlog. We have proposed reducing 2 staff positions, one in planning and one in engineering. The Urban Forestry Division is responsible for our urban canopy, our trees, including round-the-clock emergency tree work, permitting, education, enforcement of the Title 11 tree code, tree planting, and more. Urban forestry has experienced significant general fund cuts in recent years. These have been offset with greater reliance on revenue. Resources have not kept pace with increased responsibilities and workload, resulting in slower service times and shortfalls in tree code implementation. At this time, we do not propose reductions. This slide represents our central administration, the Director's Office, Operations and Strategies, and Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. These departments provide support to daily operations and strategic direction. This division has been significantly cut in previous years and is another area where we are facing workload challenges. These support functions have not grown as the Bureau has grown. Nonetheless, we have proposed eliminating several staff positions, including 1 customer service position, 2 positions in finance performance, 2 positions in the Ranger program, in addition to adjustments to seasonal Ranger staffing, as well as 1 position in equity, inclusion, and community engagement. We would also reduce spending on materials and services. Also, several community groups receive pass-through funding from this division's budget, meaning their work is not staffed by park staff. We have proposed reducing their funding by 5%. In Recreation Services, the division most affected by reductions, we have used the following criteria to evaluate funding proposals. The proposed budget strives to prioritize vulnerable and historically underserved populations, provide equitable geographic access, and prioritize the use of significant community investments like our large community centers, where we can generate revenue for a lower cost per customer visit. The budget also seeks to reduce deferred maintenance needs, minimize revenue loss, and affirm our commitment to arts and culture. At the direction of our commissioner in charge, in the requested budget, we propose prioritizing funding for programs that ensure access for vulnerable populations and achieving our equity goals. These include inclusion services, the senior recreation program, and summer free-for-all, to name but a few. These programs have been under-budgeted and overspent in past years. Therefore, we have proposed reallocating $813,000 in general fund resources so these programs can continue at current service levels. To do so, we are proposing reductions in other areas of recreation services. The Bureau has proposed funding St. John's and Woodstock community centers at current service levels. Peninsula Park Community Center would be funded. However, there would be a reduction in staffing. These small centers serve historically underserved populations, or in the case of Woodstock, are already close to self-funded. Recreation Services runs 5 large community centers. We are proposing broad changes to staff and programming at these centers. When re-envisioning the model, we started with the base costs of operating the facilities with basic drop-in use, and then added in programs and services that maximize service delivery within a defined staffing model. This will allow us to better manage expenses. The proposed budget strives to continue current hours of operation, drop-in use of gyms, fitness facilities and pools, group fitness classes, swimming lessons, and more. The new business model proposes reductions of approximately $2.2 million, which accounts for the revenue loss. We'll scale back on some activities and discontinue others. As part of our transition plan, we are also requesting funding to continue 2019 summer camps and programming to keep the commitments for which people have already registered. In addition to the changes in the large community centers, our requested budget includes programming reductions. I'm going to walk you through these by program from left to right, outlining both what will continue to be funded in these programs as well as proposed reductions. In teen services, we propose to retain a staffed presence at the 5 Teen Force locations. Teen Force would continue to offer after-school activities, leadership development, teen council, and modified teen nights. At Montevilla Community Center, the focus shifts to preschool and Teen Force. The Teen Services program would reduce staffing and would align the hours of programming with peak attendance times, Monday through Friday. Partnership agreements with youth-serving nonprofits would be slightly reduced. Funding for gang outreach would return to the 2017-2018 staffing levels. In addition, Montevilla Community Center would see staff and program reductions. Even with these reductions, though, the teen program would still be 3 times the size it was in 2015. For our urban parks, we would maintain current service levels for programming at Gateway Discovery Park, and we anticipate program would continue at Holiday Park with partner support. At Director Park, we would focus on rentals and would reduce staff coverage and free arts and culture programming. Finally, we've proposed changes in recreation administration. We'll keep and consolidate citywide recreation and recreation support systems. This reduction of 3 staff positions would require Recreation Services to reprioritize its operational and strategic capacity. We also have identified savings in restructuring the janitorial contract for community centers. We are requesting transition plan funding for summer programming at Montevilla Community Center as well. The following facilities would be most changed by partnerships, new operating models, or closures, and include staffing reductions. At Fulton Community Center, we are actively pursuing a partnership and lease. The partner would also manage space rentals. At Laurelhurst Dance Studio and Hillside Community Center, we would discontinue programming and our team would actively pursue lease opportunities with the intent of continuing to provide public benefit. If lease agreements cannot be secured, those facilities would be closed. In addition to lease models, we are looking at new partnership models. At Community Music Center, we would update the partnership agreement with Community Music Center, Inc., seeking a new sustainable operating and partnership model. At Multnomah Art Center, we would identify a new sustainable business model that includes seeking new partnerships. Ongoing general fund would be eliminated. We are also requesting funds to transition some of these facilities. Additionally, we would close the following: Selwood Community Center, a facility with significant deferred maintenance, would close in September 2019. We are requesting transition plan funds for summer programming. And Columbia Pool would close in July 2020. The long-term goal is to have an aquatics facility at nearby Charles Jordan Community Center. This goal, coupled with the significant maintenance required to keep Columbia Pool open, has led to the proposed closure. We are requesting 1 year of funding to operate Columbia Pool and find alternatives for stakeholders like Rosa Parks Elementary, Portland Interscholastic League, Roosevelt High School, and the surrounding community. In total, the budget proposes 70 full-time and part-time positions reduced. 20 of these are vacant. 50 full-time and part-time team members are affected. This total is 56.06 full-time equivalents. We are working with the Bureau of Human Resources to provide support. This is part of a citywide strategy to give first interview opportunity to those affected by layoffs. We will be working to identify potential new positions for affected employees. And wherever possible, we will hold vacancies and take other steps to redeploy our affected team members to positions that have retained funding. With represented positions, we will follow the appropriate labor agreement and layoff bumping process. These are hard choices, but without the expectation of additional ongoing general fund, the proposal before you is responsive to the direction we were given to balance our budget. But change takes time and carries risk. For that reason, as you've seen throughout the presentation, we have requested one-time transition plan resources totaling $3.2 million. These transition funds would mitigate near-term impacts on our customers who are already registering for summer programming. The transition plan funds will also reduce the risk associated with the business model changes, and the funds will allow for the needed project management and community engagement to implement the solutions we've set forth. I'm going to pass it back to Claudio.
So as you consider the proposal before you, please note that without action, our operating budget gap is expected to grow to $9.3 million over 5 years. In order to deal with this and move toward financial sustainability, we can reduce costs, raise more revenue through program fees and partnerships, or we as a city can dedicate more ongoing general fund. The proposal we have before you today closes the gap in the near term and leads to a balanced budget in 1920. However, the challenges we discussed earlier remain. By being more intentional about managing costs and planning fee increases, we aim to stay on top of these challenges. We are underway on several bodies of work that will help us move to long-term sustainability and plan to continue this conversation with you later this year. Adina?
Very good. Sorry. Go ahead.
Just thank you again for your time and consideration, and we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks, Director Long. And before we get to questions, could we also have Director Kennard give us a brief overview of the document that you handed out prior to the hearing today?
Yes, sorry. So the City Budget Office completed our analysis of the plan just before this work session, so you all have not had time to read it, so we'll provide a brief overview of the highlights. So CBO acknowledges that identifying these reductions has been a monumental and challenging task, and we really commend the Bureau for their efforts to take this on. We also acknowledge that there are no easy reductions. We've had limited time to review the plan, but generally, we've found that the Bureau has put forward a thoughtful plan that aligns with the desire to preserve core services for the most people, to preserve equity, and to minimize fiscally unsustainable practices. Many of the proposals are consistent with packages that the Bureau has put forward in the past. However, the Bureau has taken the additional step in many cases of looking for options to minimize the service level impact. So this is with the situation like with some of the community centers looking for leases, looking for ways to preserve services. CBO has found two overarching points that we want to be sure to highlight. One, which has also been highlighted by the Bureau, is that these are short-term solutions that will resolve the immediate challenge at hand, but that these solutions will not solve for the underlying issue that has led to this crisis. Resolving this larger issue will require a fundamental reevaluation of the Bureau's business model, and this is critical and urgent work to be done over the next year. The other concern is in relation to aspects of the one-time bridge funding. So the bridge funding is requested to essentially buy more time to ensure a smooth transition off of the ongoing resources as the Bureau has stated. CBO has recommended at least $650,000, allocating at least $650,000 of those one-time resources to help the Bureau transition to its regional recreational services model, and this is in alignment with our very strict criteria that we evaluated all bureaus across the city on. So this was one aspect of the plan that we felt certainly hit that level of preserving or mitigating financial and legal risk to the city. Additionally, it's important to note that the Bureau has assumed as part of its balancing plan nearly $1 million in one-time resources to continue funding the Multnomah Arts Center and Columbia Pool for another year. While there certainly is reason for council to provide this funding to ensure the smooth transition, CBO just wants to note that there is a risk by providing one-time resources that we're simply building a later cliff if the Bureau is not able to successfully transition off of these ongoing resources. So we've provided a basic level of analysis on all the various elements of the plan that's been put forward, and we can provide additional input if desired on those components.
Welcome, new Parkey. I am a former Parkey myself. First of all, this is an impressive budget and it's very brave. I thank you for your own bravery in presenting it today, and I agree that sometimes we have to do these cuts, especially in face of other priorities of the city. My question is for the summer camps, which communities will be affected by those cuts? And also a little bit, if you could expand on the gang outreach services that will be cut.
So I'll start with gang outreach. So the teen program has had 2 contracted gang outreach workers for several years. In 18-19, we increased that by 2. So this would be returning to the 17-18 levels. And that also corresponds with the shrinking of the programming. So we're going to be moving to peak hours rather. So we're going to be shrinking the number of hours and reducing the number of teen nights. So we're going to be needing fewer gang outreach workers during that time. So with regard to which communities would be most impacted, the summer programming is being reduced at those facilities. So we're asking for transition funding for the facilities that are being reduced. So that would be Hillside, Sellwood, and then there's also some expectation that we'll be changing programming at the large community centers as well. And so this would maintain the programming that we already currently have scheduled. We'll continue to have summer programming in the future, just not at the same level.
Welcome to Portland. Just a few quick questions, and if you don't have the information at your fingertips, just feel free to follow up with my office. Curious about the demographics of residents who live outside of East Portland and are among those 1 in 5 households that are not within a half mile of park or natural area. I think the assumption is that those may be lower income communities, but they may not be, so I'm really interested in those demographics. Second, I don't know how many parks projects are still in the pipeline in East Portland, but if we have a new kind of projected numbers as far as this access within a half mile when those parks are completed? I'd love to know, because I've got a particular interest in East Portland, as do many people at this table. And then, do we have any kind of similar aspiration for community centers? Because obviously not every park has a community center.
What do you mean by similar aspiration?
Well, would we like every resident to live within 20 blocks of a community center?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that slide was really illustrative of the levels of service that were set in the Vision 2020 plan. So they're levels of service that we've lived with for a long time. The half-mile one is one. 3 miles to a full-service community center is another. And that's one that we'll be revisiting as we go into the next Vision plan to really determine what is a sustainable level of service, because those are very, very big and expensive facilities to run and maintain. They're very expensive to build, but they are also a very efficient and robust way of delivering recreation services. So, maybe potentially looking at what that radius might look like, but that is definitely an issue for the
Commissioner Daly, the approximate $900,000 in ongoing O&M that is not recommended for funding by CBO represents 38 different projects that have all been aggregated. They are new parks, playgrounds, investments, predominantly in East Portland as part of an equity plan funded by both the Parks Bond that Commissioner Fritz led and by the Robust Systems Development Charge account that we have. We're going to get you an updated list off of our 5-year CIP and other documents of other investments we have to make, but as that chart illustrated, East Portland continues to lag the city, and we are extremely committed to continuing Commissioner Fritz's work. We have though raised the caution flag that if we can't count on getting O&M when we open the parks, what we're saying to people is at the very moment we're trying to bring equity to East Portland, we're saying we're backing off a commitment to paying to maintain them at the level that the rest of the city enjoys, and that's just unacceptable to me.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And also, I'm sorry,
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, Commissioner Daly, also, we'll get back to you on the demographic question.
Okay, because my next question was, has there been an analysis of the impact that these closures will have as far as attaining this 3-mile goal, and what their alternatives for residents in those communities are?
So there would be no impacts to the 3-mile goal. So the only impact that we would have is with the closure of Columbia Pool. If you include that as being sort of part and parcel of the Charles Jordan Community Center, because it is nearby, and to the degree that those two together would provide a level of service comparable to a full-service community center, we would be reducing that.
How far away is Charles Jordan?
I would have to get back to you on the exact distance, but
Okay,
it's quite close.
I'm not sure where either of those go. I go out to Mount Scott. So,
Commissioner Daly, I've been informed by a dedicated parkie, Jen Yoakum, that it's about a half mile.
oh, well, thank you, Jennifer. I thought I had a couple more notes, but I seem to have lost track. I'll just put it out there. I'm interested in the conversation about urban forestry and how we may be able to manage that better. I see the little note about the transit mall, and I sit on that committee, so we'll be talking about that. And I guess I really appreciate you prioritizing areas and communities that are already underserved, in particular people with disabilities in East Portland and communities of color. And I just want to say that when we face years like this, arts and culture, which I would include parks in, always feels like the first and the most kind of harsh cut, and that I see them as vital to healthy, resilient communities. And I'm just sorry that this is the scenario that you're walking into, and I hope that we can fix it.
I appreciate that. I think that the proposal that we put forth does hold harmless a lot of our arts and culture programming, and I'm confident that we're going to be able to find a transition plan that would allow CMC and MAC to continue to provide a public benefit to the community.
Thank you.
Welcome, Commissioner Long. Not Commissioner, Director. Welcome to Portland, and I'm very sorry that you're coming into a cut budget, but some days are like that, right? My question has to do with if there are 50 or 70 staff, I can't remember, that will...
So it's 70 lines. 20 of those are currently vacant, so it's 50 staff.
And what is the demographic breakdown of the people who will be losing their position? And how will that impact your equity goals as you move forward? And if you don't know, it's okay, and you can tell me later.
So the positions that are impacted won't necessarily be the people that are impacted. So we're working through those numbers to figure out what the results of bumping would be. Right now, the positions that are impacted are slightly more representative amongst people of color, but we won't know until we've done the full analysis. We did present the percentage bureau-wide of people of color, and we expect that given the initial estimates, we likely won't go further down than about 25%.
You won't go further down than what?
Further down than 25%.
Or 25.
And we're at a little over 28 right now.
So I'm also curious about fees for service. Today, I can actually afford a membership, and at the parks, if I wanted to join a community center, today I could afford it. But most of my life here, I have not been able to afford a membership. And I'm curious as to whether you've done an analysis about whether there should be a sliding scale, because I think people who can pay more don't, and people who can't pay what is currently being asked don't have access to these community centers. So has any analysis been done about how do we make sure that we're making the most out of the fees for service? So I'll give you a great example. Trying to have a party in one of the rooms at a community center is cost prohibitive, or at least it used to be before I got this job. It might still be, but it was before I got this job. And so it feels very unaccessible if you're a low-income person and you're trying to use a system that's supposedly set up for you and your community. And so I'm just curious about whether we've done that kind of analysis.
So the discussion of scholarships has been an ongoing one in the Bureau. We do have a scholarship program. I believe that it's primarily around programming and not so much about rentals, so I could take a look into that. But I do know that that question of how are we going to provide that sliding scale, that level of subsidy is definitely a key piece of how we move forward and get to it.
The sliding scale issue is on the table. Thank you for raising it. I was with Commissioner Fritz and Director Long at Southwest Community Center last Friday at a stand with immigrant and refugee event, and this couple came up to me, and they're retirees, concerned about the cuts that they've been reading about. They each pay about $50 a month to access Southwest Community Center, and they said that they were doing well in their retirement, and they'd be willing to pay a little bit more. So one of the challenges we have is we haven't done our cost recovery study. That this crisis has intervened ahead of us having the data that we would share with you. I personally think the sliding scale is something we need to take a good hard look at. We need to take a look at scholarships. But the other thing I just want to highlight is, with the cost of inflation, healthcare costs going up, PERS costs going up, everything else, the general fund this year is assuming a 7 or 8% bump for everybody. Whatever we agree to as a new system, we'd have to be raising those fees, 7, 8, 9% a year. So at some point, I don't know when, because we haven't done the analysis, but at some point, we start pricing people out. Even on a sliding scale, we become unaffordable. This council has said, keep those doors open, but when 50% of your recreation services are funded by a fee that doesn't rise like the general fund does to cover the inflationary costs, we have a structural problem. And, but my commitment to you, Commissioner, is that we'll take a good look at sliding scale. I think it has a lot of merit.
I'd like to put in a second on the sliding scale option. I mean, I wish we had a sliding scale for the arts tax. I wish we had a sliding scale for the arts museum. We have a community that's incredibly generous with their time and money, some of the highest rates of volunteerism in the city of Portland in the country. But we're not telling people the true value of what they're receiving from us, and we're not giving them an opportunity to give more if they want to. And as a small business owner and someone who's worked in nonprofits, I know that there are a lot of generous people out there that just don't know how to support issues or causes and would welcome that invitation. It just feels like a missed opportunity. And I don't think you'll find a mad rush of people exploiting a system like that.
I've got several questions. I happened to be at Hazelwood Association last night, and I shared what, I actually got through that 64-page document you guys sent out yesterday afternoon, and a lot of things caught my eye. And I appreciate the work you're doing, trying to be very thoughtful. And I shared with them that their services as programmed for this summer would go on, but they should be aware that you were going to have to make some cuts in the following year. I wanted to know, you say you run Sun Schools. How many Sun Schools do you run, and is that funded out of parks or the children's levy? If you don't know, you can get back to me.
I would need to get back to you on the number of Sun Schools. It is funded, in fact, Commissioner.
It's 11.
Oh.
And
Yeah, 11 Sun Schools, and they are all general fund. The Children's Levy does participate in the program, but it's a consortium, and so there are a number of Sun Schools that are funded by the Children's Levy and by Multnomah County.
Yeah, I'm aware of the Sun School program. That's why when I saw you're funding them, I was questioning it, because it really is the Children's Levy and the county that are programming it. And I'm all for them. I'm just bringing out some points.
Rita, just to be clear, we run 11 Sun School programs. They're general fund. And we have, because of the population being served and because of the filters we're using on this budget, we have not proposed significant cuts to that because we knew that would not be well received by the community.
Okay. As to generating revenue, I found out that East Portland's Community Center takes Silver Sneakers. For those that aren't aware, for those that like us are retired, it's an exercise program that's paid often through their health insurance. And I'm assuming you're getting dollars from that program as revenue if you're providing the services.
Which program specifically?
Silver Sneakers?
So
Okay.
We do. Yeah.
Okay, all I'm going to say is I just happened to run across it. Expanding your communication to the seniors, and there's a lot in East Portland, you might get more revenue because I'm sure it's by head you're getting it. And now I'm going to get to early childhood. As a school board member, I'm really pro early childhood, but I believe there was a budget note that was to be self-sustaining or try to be self-sustaining, but I saw it mentioned again and again and again in that report I got yesterday afternoon. Are you self-sustaining with early childhood programs?
So this year we do expect to be direct cost recovery, so self-sustaining in the sense that for providing the programming, we are achieving the revenue to support that's direct programming. Okay. So not the facilities, et cetera. But with increased fees, we likely have changed the demographic that we serve a bit as we move to that self-sustaining model this year.
Okay, I would encourage you to follow what's going on in the educational environment. The committee, legislative committee going around the state, early childhood is a high priority. So they're looking at added funding to schools to add it. And if the local schools are providing it free, you might be able to cut back on your early childhood if you watch what is happening. David Douglas has 3 schools within of its 9 that provides totally free programming for early childhood. And one happens to be right close by to the East Portland Community Center. So just a thought that you should be looking at that. I noticed you were cutting the dance studio. Another thought is there is a nonprofit, Metro Performing Arts on 86th and Stark, that actually the creator of that worked for Parks, and when there were some cutbacks in dance, she moved creating this, and so that is with Laurelhurst Dance Studio being closed. You might want to direct people to a nonprofit that, because they do scholarships, et cetera, trying to serve the underserved population. And on the Columbia pool, do you have an IGA with PPS in regard to their use of the pool for their schools?
You know, I'm not familiar with that, but I could find out about that.
Okay. The question is, as a school that provides its own pool, and pools are expensive, we spent $7 million on ours, you might talk with them if they want that programming to stay in that location, if they would want to do an IGA where they take responsibility for the pool, since several of their schools are using it.
Frida, let me just say that in our budget, we don't propose to close any outdoor pools. Columbia Pool presents 2 challenges. One is a operating gap. 2 is a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance that we're not going to be able to get to. And that's why a parallel conversation has emerged about thinking about adding an aquatic center to Charles Jordan. That fits within our overall model of beefing up our 5 major community centers and making them full service. Plus, we can use systems development charge money to put in a state-of-the-art aquatic center, which will have lower operating costs long-term. We are proposing in this budget 1-year bridge funding to figure these issues out. And the question you're raising about whether we enter into an IGA with PIL or PP&R or anyone else, where they take on some of the obligations, is a good one. And it's one of the reasons why we're asking for a 1-year bridge funding, because we don't think we'll have that decided by July 1st.
And that's fine. When we're talking equity, when Douglas is providing that service, but PPS is getting access to those things for their regular programming, it is kind of inequitable. I think, in regard to arts and cultures, I'm for it, but I'm curious on the arts tax, if any of the art tax is going. I know half of it goes to the schools for their music programs. The other half, I believe, goes to RAC. And if there's some kind of conversation about sharing that other half, if you're bringing it down right into the communities. Just some thoughts.
So I want to acknowledge how difficult this is for everybody, for the community, especially for the staff, and I'm thanking all the park staff who are here for your diligent work on this. Thank you, Commissioner Fish. I do it too. Your staff gave me a thorough briefing yesterday, and obviously I can follow up with you. I would just want to say that for the most part, I support what your approach. It's good to see that you're continuing some of the processes that were in place, that had already been started, like particularly cost recovery and financial sustainability. And so I also need to note that when we had a problem with not being able to hire enough police officers, all of a sudden it was all hands on deck. How can we get another $6 million and raise the business tax? And so as we're looking at long-term sustainability for the park system, parks is a basic service just like fire and police. And we need to, I think the community would be willing to have some other revenue source. It's really tempting to go for a parks district, which would then take the parks slice out of the budget first, just like the county took the library tax, and that cost the city, what was it, 9 million, 11 million, something like that. We've resisted that in the past, but I do think we need to have that conversation as to how can we get more revenue so that Portlanders want these services. We're certainly getting a lot of input from community members on them, and I'll be following up with you on specific questions. I think somebody said it best that I read yesterday, is this is the one thing that the city provides that I actually like. You know, in terms of many of the other things are basic services, water and sewer, etc., but not exactly, except for water, which is delicious and everybody should drink more of it. Parks is the place where, as the great Charles Jordan said, it's more than fun and games. It's part of the fabric of our community, and I really hope that we can continue funding that value.
I have a question about the teen program, and I understand that all of these proposed reductions are very, very difficult. What led you to the reductions in the teen program, and what do you think the impact would be on gang-impacted youth?
So I think in general, we looked at the program across the board. So there are 5 large community centers where the teen program is offered. And what we did was we identified strategically when the youth are generally in the area, and we targeted the hours, Monday through Friday, during peak hours, in order to continue to provide the service, but at a much more targeted, in a much more select, targeted way.
Do you have a sense of the number of youth currently being served who would not be served, or can you give us any other metrics in terms of outreach to the young people who are specifically gang impacted?
Certainly. In fiscal year 17-18, we had just over 60,000 teens visit the teen center.
But they're not all gang impacted, right?
I don't know if we actually make that distinction.
If you could just dig into that, if you can find that information, that'd be helpful for me, because there's some intersects with other bureaus. And then you probably said this, and I just can't find it. You mentioned reductions in the park ranger program. Have you identified how many reductions and where those reductions would be?
So we've got 2 reductions in full-time staff and a reduction in seasonal staff. So the 2 reductions in full-time staff would be 1 supervisor moving. So we've got the supervisor of the program and 3 supervisors under them. So we would be going down to 2 underneath the supervisor, and then we would also be eliminating one ranger position. The seasonal staffing would reduce our capacity in the summertime.
Okay, thank you.
And also, Mayor, another piece to your previous question, over 60% of the youth served in Teen Force come from underserved and communities of color. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but it does put some into context.
Thank you.
I also had some questions generally about the program reductions and whether the suggested program reductions are based on low utilization. I mean, in addition to the framework that you offered about making sure you're not cutting services in specific communities, if that were the case. And then also, I would like a little bit of a description on what janitorial contract efficiency means. Thanks.
So I would actually need to get back to you on the janitorial contract efficiency. I know that the Recreation Services team has been working on that actually for quite some time. So it's an efficiency that we've been working towards for quite a bit. And as far as the lower utilization, I know that is definitely an area that they were looking for when they were developing these reductions, identifying places where we have lower utilization, and I think more broadly speaking, where our provision of service is less efficient. So I think that's one of the reasons why we focus on the large community centers as opposed to the small. They tend to be more expensive to operate. So that is an area, and just relative utilization, the numbers are quite stark. So.
And I can actually field the janitorial contract question. No, I think that Recreation Services just looked at the overall service provision of the contract and worked with the contractor themselves to identify where there may have been some inefficiencies so that we could get a little bit more bang for our buck, as it were. So there was a little bit of trimming of the fat.
Very good. Thank you, Director Long. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our citizen budget advisors. Thank you to my colleagues. We will be back on Tuesday, March 19th at 9:30 to talk about, I'm sorry, I'm wrong.
Today is Tuesday.
That's correct. Monday, April 1st. April Fools, everyone. We'll be talking about Prosper Portland, the Office of Community and Civic Life, the Office of Government Relations, special appropriations, and then do we have a special session scheduled yet?
We will also have the Office of Community Technology, and I will be following up individually with your offices to see if there's additional topics that you'd like to cover.
Okay, very good. And I'll just say in advance, and I'll repeat this on Monday, that is a very tight schedule. So we're going to really hold people to it. Thank you.